So hey guys, this is your favorite fictional vortex. So in this video, we will see what if Naruto was a reincarnated dragon god who trained the Sword King. Naruto x Ghislaine Dedoldia Mushoku Tensei, Jobless Reincarnation. But before we start, remember to subscribe and like this video. Now let's start. Chapter 1. The Dragon's Slumber, the Sword Cat's Desperation. The shame was a physical thing, a branding iron pressed against the inside of her skin. It burned hotter than the humid air clinging to her matted, sweat-soaked fur, hotter and the lactic acid screaming in her thighs. It was a suffocating, internal fire that the oppressive atmosphere of the great forest only seemed to feed. Ghislaine Dedoldia ran. She ran with the desperation of a cornered animal, which, in every way that mattered, she was. The Dedoldia village was far behind her now, a collection of sturdy wooden homes and proud, sneering faces that she hoped would be swallowed by the horizon and forgotten. But the memory of their scorn was a pack of wolves at her heels, their phantom bites more painful than any physical wound. Useless. The word echoed in her mind, spoken in her father's booming, disappointed voice. A Dedoldia who cannot grasp the way of the sword god is no Dedoldia at all. I can grasp it, she snarled internally, her powerful legs churning through the thick, sucking mud of the forest floor. A vibrant, iridescent beetle the size of her fist clicked past her ear, and she batted it away with a reflexive swipe of her claws, not even breaking her stride. Her grasp of the sword god's style wasn't the problem. She was strong, stronger than her brothers. She was faster, her beastkin blood granting her a physical prowess that made them green with envy. She could swing a greatsword with enough force to cleave a lesser man in two before he'd even registered the threat. The problem was the subtlety, the nuance, the thinking. You fight like a boulder rolling downhill. Ghislaine. All force, no direction. You lack the insight, the perception. You see the enemy, but you do not see their intent. Her swordmaster's words were a calmer, more cutting poison. He hadn't shouted. He had simply sighed, a sound of weary resignation that had flayed her pride raw. She had challenged him, her rage and humiliation boiling over into a reckless assault. She had been disarmed in 3 moves. 3. Her greatsword, her extension of self, had been sent spinning into the dirt, and she was left standing there, fists clenched, panting, with the tip of his wooden practice sword resting gently against her throat. The pity in his eyes was the final, unforgivable insult. So she ran. She had grabbed her sword, a scant few provisions, and plunged into the wilds of the demon continent. A place where weakness was a death sentence. It was a suicidal act, and some part of her knew it. But it was better than the slow death of her spirit in that village, where every gaze felt like an accusation and every word of praise for her siblings felt like a stone cast at her. Here, in the great forest, the threats were honest. A monster did not mock your intelligence, it simply tried to eat you. There was a purity in that she could understand. A guttural roar ripped through the humid air from her left. She didn't slow. Her amber eyes, slitted like a cat's, darted towards the sound. A bogle, a thick-set, gorilla-like creature with mossy fur and tusks like sharpened ivory, crashed through the undergrowth. It was a C-rank threat, trivial on its own, but she was already running on fumes. Perfect. Let it come. Let her burn this foul-tasting shame into the satisfying crunch of bone and sinew. Instead of avoiding it, Ghislaine altered her course, her VY boots finding purchase on a gnarled root. She met the beast's charge head-on. Her greatsword, a slab of iron nearly as tall as she was already in her hands. It felt heavy, a familiar, comforting weight. She didn't bother with the proper stances her master had tried to drill into her. Stances were for duels. This was a slaughter. Gya. The roar that tore from her own throat was one of pure, undiluted fury. She met the bogle's downward smash not with a parry, but with a brutal, opposing swing. The clang of steel on tusk sent a shockwave up her arms, but her beastkin strength held true. The bogle's tusk cracked, and it staggered back, shaking its head in a daze. Ghislaine gave it no quarter. She brought her sword around in a wide, horizontal arc aimed at its thick neck. It was a clumsy, telegraphed move, one that relied entirely on speed and power. A true swordsman would have sidestepped and pierced her exposed side. The bogle, being a beast, simply tried to block with its massive forearm. The blade bit deep. It wasn't a clean cut. The sword sheared through tough hide, thick muscle, and grated against bone with a stomach-turning screech. Blackish blood sprayed across her face, hot and metallic. The beast howled in agony, its arm hanging by a thread of flesh. Ghislaine wrenched the sword free and lunged, driving the point straight into the creature's chest. She pushed with all her weight, feeling the ribs crack in the desperate, final struggles of the life beneath her. The light faded from its beady eyes, and it collapsed, pinning her sword to the ground beneath its bulk. Panting, she placed a boot on its chest and heaved, pulling her weapon free with a wet squelch. She stood there for a long moment, chest heaving, her vision swimming with black spots from the exertion. The rage was sated, for now. But the shame remained, a cold, hard knot in her stomach. She hadn't outthought the beast. She had simply overpowered it. A boulder rolling downhill, her master's voice was a persistent ghost. She spat on the ground, the glob of saliva thick with blood from a lip she'd bitten in the fray. Survival was what mattered here. Nothing else. She scavenged what edible meat she could from the carcass, her movements practiced and efficient, before resuming her flight into the suffocating green vastness. Days blurred into a monotonous cycle of survival. The great forest was a living, breathing entity that actively tried to kill her. The trees themselves were predators, with bark like razored scales and vines that constricted like pythons. The ground was a treacherous mire of sucking mud, hidden sinkholes, and roots that seemed to shift when she wasn't looking. The air was a soup of strange, cloying pollens that made her head swim and her eyes water. Gigantic, blood-red mosquitoes with needle-like proboscises hunted her in buzzing clouds, forcing her to coat her exposed skin in a layer of foul-smelling mud. She fought. Constantly, she fought packs of grim wolves. Their fur the color of shadow, their intelligence just high enough to make them tactical threats. She fought armored centipedes that spat corrosive acid. She fought a territorial nay-backed boar that nearly shattered her sword, and her ribs, with a single, devastating charge. Each fight was the same. A desperate, brutal explosion of her superior strength and speed. She won, but she accumulated wounds. A deep gash on her calf that she stitched together with a crude needle and gut. A collection of festering insect bites on her back. A persistent, dull ache in her shoulder that spoke of a strained ligament. Her Tuki, the fighting spirit that all warriors cultivated, was a raging, uncontrolled fire. She could channel it to enhance her strength and speed, but it was inefficient. She burned through her reserves like a dry forest fire, leaving her exhausted and vulnerable after every major engagement. She knew, intellectually, that the proper application of Tuki was a gentle flow. A reinforcement of the body's natural lines of power. But thinking about lines of power while a fanged horror was trying to tear her throat out was a luxury she couldn't afford. So she opted for the explosion, the raw, unrefined blast of power that got the job done, even if it left her gasping for air and seeing stars. Her provisions ran out. Hunger became a constant, gnawing companion. She ate what she could find, rubbery, tasteless fungi that grew on the underside of living trees, grubs dug from rotting logs that popped with a disgusting bitterness in her mouth, and the tough, ingy meat of the monsters she managed to kill. Water was easier to find, dripping from broad leaves or collected in pools of stagnant rainwater, but it often carried sickness, forcing her to spend one miserable night vomiting until her stomach was a hollow, aching void. Despair was a slow-acting poison. In the violet twilight that passed for night in this part of the world, she would huddle in the hollow of a great root, her sword across her lap, and listen to the cacophony of the forest. The chittering, the hissing, the distant roars, it was a symphony of death. In these quiet moments, the shame returned, colder and sharper than before. She wasn't just running away. She was dying, slowly, pathetically, in the middle of nowhere. Her quest for strength had led her to this, a grimy, wounded, half-starved creature cowering in the dark. The sheer futility of it all threatened to crush her. She thought of her family. Her proud father, Ghislaine I. Her condescending brothers, even her mother, whose quiet disappointment was somehow the worst of all. They had likely already written her off. Ghislaine, the reckless one, went into the great forest. A fool's end for a foolish girl. The thought sent a fresh wave of rage through her, and the rage was what kept her going. It was a cleaner fuel than despair. She would not give them the satisfaction. She would get stronger. She would return one day. Not as a prodigal daughter, but as a force of nature they could not ignore. She would be a Sword King, or she would be nothing. It was this stubborn, self-destructive pride that pushed her onward. Deeper into the forest's heart, into territories that even S-rank adventurers spoke of with caution. She had no map, no destination. She was simply moving, driven by a blind instinct that screamed away. Away from the Dedoldia, away from her failure, away from the pity in her master's eyes. She was a weapon in search of a worthy fire to be forged in, and she was convinced that the deeper she went, the hotter the flames would be. It was on the 10th day, or perhaps the 12th, she had lost count, that something changed. She had just finished a grueling battle with a pair of shadow panthers. Sleek black predators that could turn semi-invisible in the dim light. She was bleeding from a dozen shallow cuts, her breathing ragged. She leaned against the trunk of a colossal, purple-barked tree, trying to catch her breath. When she first felt it, it wasn't a sound. The forest was as noisy as ever, a chaotic blend of screeches, calls, and the incessant drone of insects. This was a sensation, a low-frequency hum that seemed to vibrate not in the air, but in the very marrow of her bones. It was faint, almost imperceptible, like the deep thrum of a colossal drum beaten miles away. It was a feeling of peace, of calm. This was so alien to her current existence that she straightened up, her exhaustion momentarily forgotten. Her sensitive cat-like ears twitched, trying to pinpoint a source, but there was none. The hum was everywhere and nowhere. It was beneath her feet, in the air she breathed, in the wood of the tree at her back. And as she focused on it, she noticed something else. The forest was quieting. The incessant chittering of smaller creatures began to fade. The distant roars ceased. Even the ever-present buzz of the blood-sucking mosquitoes seemed to diminish. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath, cowering before something. Ghislaine's hand tightened on the hilt of her sword. Her every instinct screamed that she should run in the opposite direction. A presence that could cow the entire great forest was a presence of unimaginable power, something far beyond what she could hope to fight. A demon lord, an ancient dragon, but the hum, it didn't feel malevolent. It felt ancient, implacable, a vast, sleeping power that radiated tranquility as a star radiated light. And it pulled at her. It was a gentle but persistent summons, a siren song for the warrior soul within her. Here, it seemed to whisper in a language without words. Here is the strength you seek. Here is the forge. Her suicidal pride warred with her instinct for self-preservation. To turn back now was to admit defeat, to accept that there were fires too hot for her. To go forward was to walk knowingly into the jaws of a lion, armed with nothing but a stick. She stood there for a full minute, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The hum grew infinitesimally stronger, a steady, resonant pulse of power that promised either apotheosis or annihilation. With a curse that was half prayer, half defiance, she chose the lion's maw. She began to walk, not away, but towards the source of the hum. The journey changed. The further she walked, the quieter the forest became. The predators were gone, replaced by an eerie silence. The oppressive humidity began to lessen, the air growing cleaner, clearer. The very color of the flora began to shift. The lurid purples and sickly greens of the outer forest gave way to a palette of grays and whites. The trees grew thinner, their bark becoming smooth and pale, like sun-bleached bone. The ground underfoot was no longer mud, but a fine, gray ash that puffed up with each step. She walked for hours, the pull growing stronger, the silence more profound. It was a dead world she had entered, a pocket of non-life within the teeming, hyper-vibrant great forest. She saw no animals, no insects, not even a single blade of grass. There was only the ash, the pale, skeletal trees, and the overwhelming, resonant hum-o. Power that now filled her senses completely. It was no longer just in her bones, it was a pressure against her skin, a taste like ozone on her tongue. It made the Tuki in her body feel like a flickering candle next to a sun. Finally, she came to the edge of a great cliff and looked down. Below her was a sight that stole the breath from her lungs. It was a perfect circle of oblivion carved into the world, a crater several miles across. She was standing on the precipice of what the old maps, the ones that marked this area with a skull and crossbones, called the Ashen Maw. The crater was filled with a forest of petrified trees. Their trunks a ghostly white, their branches reaching for a sky that was a permanent, bruised twilight. Not a single leaf adorned them. They were stone monuments to a long-dead woodland. The ground was not ash here, but smooth, black obsidian that seemed to drink the dim light. And the silence was absolute. Not just quiet, but a true, crushing void of sound that made her ears ring in protest. And in the exact center of the maw, the source of the power she had been chasing, was a phenomenon that defied all reason. There, floating roughly a foot above a perfectly circular disk of polished obsidian, was the figure of a man. Ghislaine dropped to a crouch behind a petrified stump, her heart hammering against her ribs. She squinted, her enhanced eyesight piercing the gloom. The man was asleep. His head was tilted slightly to the side, his breathing slow and even. He was dressed in simple black trousers and a high-collared white shirt, both of a material she didn't recognize. Both immaculately clean despite the ashen environment. His hair was the color of a brilliant sunrise, a shocking splash of gold in the monochrome landscape. His features were handsome, but etched with a deep, profound weariness, even in sleep. This was the source of the hum. The power radiated from him in gentle, silent waves. It was not Tuki. It was not mana. It was something else entirely. Something more fundamental. It was the energy of creation itself, dormant but overwhelmingly potent. This being wasn't a demon lord. A demon lord commanded armies and wielded destructive magic. This felt different. This was a law of nature given human form. She watched for what felt like an eternity, paralyzed by a mixture of terror and awe. Who was he? What was he? A god? A spirit of the world? Why was he sleeping here, in the heart of this dead place? Was he the cause of it, or its prisoner? Questions swirled in her mind, a frantic, disorganized jumble. She had sought power, and she had stumbled upon its very definition. But it was a power so far beyond her comprehension that she felt like an ant observing a mountain range, incapable of grasping the scale of what she was seeing. Her paralysis was broken by a sudden, terrifying sound. It was the scraping of stone on stone, coming from the crater wall behind her. Ghislaine whirled around, her sword flashing into her hand, her body dropping into a low, defensive crouch. Scrambling down the cliff face, its 6 powerful limbs finding purchase where none should exist, was a monster from a nightmare. It was a 6-armed ape, an abyssal demon ape, an A-rank threat. Its fur was the color of dried blood, its eyes multifaceted insectoid lenses that glowed with malevolent red light. Each of its 6 hands was tipped with claws of obsidian, and its fanged maw was drooling a viscous, steaming saliva. It must have been drawn here by her presence, a lone life sign in this dead zone, and had been patient enough to stalk her. It was a creature that could single-handedly wipe out a platoon of knights. In her current, wounded, and exhausted state, fighting it was suicide. The beast dropped the last 20 feet, landing on the obsidian floor with a heavy thud that didn't even echo in the soundless void. It fixed its glowing red eyes on her, a low growl rumbling in its chest. Ghislaine's blood ran cold. All her bravado, all her rage, evaporated, replaced by the primal, crystalline fear of imminent death. She could not win this fight. She could not run. This was it. This was the fool's end she had so arrogantly challenged fate to give her. The abyssal demon ape let out a deafening roar that, unlike any other sound, seemed to carry in the maw, a testament to its sheer power. It flexed its 6 arms, its muscles hung like thick ropes under its crimson fur. It was preparing to charge, to tear her limb from limb. Ghislaine braced herself, her knuckles white on the hilt of her sword, a final, defiant snarl twisting her lips. If she was to die, she would die fighting. And then, the hum changed. It did not stop. It focused. The gentle, ambient radiation coalesced, drawing in on itself, centering on the floating figure. The sleeping man did not stir, but the air around him began to shimmer. The pressure intensified 100-fold, forcing the breath from Ghislaine's lungs and bringing her to her knees. The abyssal demon ape, in mid-lunge, froze. Its animalistic bloodlust was instantly subsumed by a far more potent, absolute terror. The monster that could shatter castles whimpered, a pathetic sound from such a fearsome creature. Slowly, as if rising from the depths of an ocean a million years deep, the sleeping man's eyes snapped open. There was no color on this dead world. There was only gray, and white, and black, and the crimson of the demon ape. But his eyes, His eyes were a color so vibrant, so pure, it felt like a wound in reality. They were the color of the deepest sea, of the midday sky, of a perfectly cut sapphire. They were the color of pure, undiluted existence. They were a brilliant, piercing, bottomless azure. They were not the eyes of a man. They were the eyes of a god, looking out upon his creation with an expression of infinite, ancient stillness. He didn't even turn his head. His gaze, calm and utterly unconcerned, fell upon the charging, now frozen demon ape. He opened his mouth, and spoke a single word. It was a word in no language Ghislaine had ever heard, a word that sounded like the universe turning in its sleep. Cheery. Dust. The effect was instantaneous and absolute. There was no explosion, no flash of light, no grand display of magic. The abyssal demon ape simply ceased to be. One moment, it was a terrifying, 14-foot-tall monster of muscle and claw. The next, it was a cascading shower of fine gray dust, indistinguishable from the ash of the forest beyond the maw. The dust settled on the pristine obsidian floor, the only evidence that the creature had ever existed. The silence that followed was more profound than before. Ghislaine knelt on the ground, her sword having slipped from her numb fingers. Her mind, which had been a whirlwind of fear and desperation, was now a perfect, shocked blank. She could not process what she had just witnessed. It was a violation of every law of nature she knew. Power on that scale was not supposed to exist. The figure lowered himself gently, his feet touching the obsidian disc with no sound. The overwhelming pressure receded, returning to the gentle, ambient hum from before. He turned his head, and for the first time, those impossible azure eyes focused directly on her. There was no anger in them, no threat. There was only a calm, ancient curiosity, a placid ocean observing a single, strange seashell washed up on its shore. He took a single step towards her, and then another, his movements fluid and silent. He stopped about 10 feet away, his presence completely dominating the dead landscape. Ghislaine could only stare, her warrior's instincts and her beastkin pride utterly annihilated in the face of this being. She was a child before a mountain. She was nothing. He tilted his head slightly, his gaze analytical as it swept over her, her torn clothes, her matted fur, her half-healed wounds, the raw desperation etched into her very soul. And then, he spoke. His voice, unlike the word of power he had uttered before, was perfectly normal, carrying easily through the impossible silence. It was calm, resonant, and held the weight of ages. You carry a heavy sword for one so lost. Tell me, child of the fangs, what is it you seek in the heart of my oblivion? Chapter 1 End. Chapter 2. The Way of the Flowing Blade. Ghislaine's mind was a slate wiped clean by the tidal wave of what she had just witnessed. The question hung in the absolute silence of the ashen maw, not as a challenge, but as a simple, profound inquiry from a being that operated on a scale she couldn't begin to fathom. What did she seek? The honest, primal answer was a desperate scream: survival, strength, respect. But those words felt like pebbles tossed into a bottomless well in his presence. Her throat was dry, her tongue a leaden weight in her mouth. She was still on her knees in the fine gray dust of the monster he had unmade, her own greatsword lying forgotten beside her. She forced herself to swallow, the sound unnervingly loud. She began, her voice a raw croak. She cleared her throat, forcing the word out with the sheer, stubborn will that had carried her this far. Strength. The azure-eyed man tilted his head again. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched the corners of his lips. It was not a smile of mockery, but of understanding, perhaps even nostalgia. A common answer, he said, his voice a calm river flowing through the dead landscape. And an honest one. But strength is a tool, not a destination. What do you intend to build with this tool? Or, perhaps, what do you intend to break? His gaze was unnervingly perceptive. He wasn't just looking at her, he was reading her. He saw the frayed edges of her soul, the burning shame that drove her, the self-destructive rage she disguised as ambition. It was a deeply uncomfortable sensation, to be so utterly transparent to a stranger. Ghislaine's natural defensiveness, her beastkin pride, began to reassert itself, a tiny spark against his bonfire of a presence. She forced herself to her feet, brushing the dust from her torn trousers. She met his gaze, her amber eyes narrowed. I seek the strength to never have to kneel again, she said, her voice firmer now. laced with defiance. To be able to crush anyone who looks down on me. I want to be the strongest. A sword king. A king, he mused, the word tasting strange on his tongue. He looked around at the silent, petrified forest that was his domain. A lonely ambition. To be a king is to stand on a peak, and all peaks are isolated. Is that what you truly want? To stand alone, above all others? His questions were chisels, chipping away at the crude block of her ambition, seeking the shape of the statue within. She hated it. She wanted him to be a monster she could fight, a demon she could bargain with. A god she could pray to. This was something else. A teacher. The thought was both terrifying and intoxicating. He had displayed a power that could likely grant her anything she wanted. Yet here he was, engaging her in a philosophical debate. Naruto, for his part, observed the defiant sword cat with a placid curiosity. In his long existence, both as a god and as a mortal, he had seen this fire 1,000 times. The desperate hunger for power born from pain. He saw a mirror of his own younger self in her, the lashing out, the desperate need for acknowledgement. The stubborn pride that served as both armor and cage. But where his pain had been born of loneliness, hers was born of humiliation. A subtle, but important, distinction. He also saw her potential. Her body was a magnificent weapon, honed by instinct and genetics, her life force a roaring, untamed bonfire. But her technique, her control, her entire approach to combat was, to his ancient eyes, akin to a child trying to fell a great tree by swinging a log at it. All force, no focus. Immensely wasteful. Your Tuki is strong, Naruto stated, changing tactics. It burns brightly, but it is like a river that has burst its dam. It floods the land, causing destruction, but spends its power in a single, chaotic rush. A true master of the river builds canals, turbines, and mills. They do not increase the river's volume, but they command its flow, directing every drop to a purpose. He took a step forward, and the ambient hum of his energy, the Shinra, intensified for a moment. Ghislaine felt the air grow thick, saw the dust at his feet stir not from wind, but from a directed, invisible current of force. You use your power like a bludgeon. I will teach you to use it like a scalpel, a shield, and a storm, all at once. The offer hung in the air. He wasn't just offering to train her. He was offering to reshape her very understanding of power. For Ghislaine, this was the moment of truth. To accept was to place her pride, her identity, everything she was, into the hands of this enigmatic being. To refuse was to walk away from the only real chance she would ever have at achieving her goal. The memory of her master's pitying gaze, of her father's disgust, made the choice for her. She bent down, picked up her greatsword, and drove its tip into the obsidian floor. She then knelt before him. A gesture of supplication that galled her to her core, but one she knew was necessary. Teach me, master. Naruto nodded, the faint smile returning. Stand up. I am not your master. A master demands obedience. I require understanding. My name is Naruto, and you will not address me with a title. Now, your training begins with a single task. Ghislaine rose, her eyes alight with anticipation. Would he have her fight ethereal beasts? Meditate until she achieved enlightenment. Cleave a mountain in two. You will fetch me water, Naruto said, his expression perfectly serious. Ghislaine blinked. What? There, at the edge of the maw, Naruto said, pointing towards the crater wall. You will notice a small trickle of water seeping from the rock. By sunrise tomorrow, I want a full waterskin. The one you carry will suffice. She looked at her waterskin, then at the distant cliff face. The trickle he mentioned was barely visible, a dark, damp stain on the rock. It would take hours, drop by painstaking drop, to fill her waterskin. It was a pointless, menial task. A test, an insult. But why? What does this have to do with swordsmanship? It has everything to do with it, Naruto replied, his voice leaving no room for argument. He turned and walked back towards his obsidian disc, sitting down cross-legged upon it. He closed his eyes, and the world fell back into its profound silence, leaving Ghislaine alone with her confusion, her greatsword, and a truly mind-numbing task. The first few weeks were a lesson in absolute frustration. Her life settled into a bizarre, maddening routine. Each day began with the same task, fetching water. The trickle from the rock face never increased, and she spent the pre-dawn hours in a state of supreme boredom, holding her water skin to the rock, listening to the infuriatingly slow plink, plink, plink of water droplets. After that, Naruto would assign her a new task, each one more pointless than the last. One day, she was to move a pile of petrified rocks from one side of the crater to the other. The next, she was to polish a section of the obsidian floor until she could see her reflection in it. Another week was spent holding a single sword stance, the Joden no Kame, from sunrise to sunset. Her muscles screamed, trembled, and eventually went numb. Naruto would sit nearby, sometimes sipping a strange, fragrant tea he produced from nowhere, and offer only the most cryptic corrections. Your left foot is half an inch too far back. You are putting the strain on your knee, not your thigh. Your shoulders are tense. You hold the sword. Do not let it hold you. Breathe. You are alive. Your stance should be too. Ghislaine's patience, a notoriously shallow resource, was worn to a thread. This is madness. She finally exploded one afternoon, after spending 6 hours trying to balance a petrified leaf on the tip of her sword. The leaf had fallen for the 100th time. I came here to learn to fight, to wield a sword, not to do chores like a scullery maid or a statue. When does the real training begin? Naruto opened one azure eye, his expression placid. The training began the moment you decided to fill that water skin. You have yet to realize it. He stood up, his movements fluid and economical. You wish to wield a sword. Very well. Attack me. A savage grin split Ghislaine's face. Finally, this was a language she understood. She didn't hesitate. She poured all her pent-up frustration and rage into her Tuki, her muscles swelling with power. She launched herself at him, her greatsword scything through the air in a vicious overhead chop. The classic opening move of the sword god style, the longsword of light. It was incredibly fast, a blur of motion that could cleave steel. Naruto didn't move from his spot. He didn't draw a weapon. As the blade descended, a hair's breadth from his skull, he simply took a small step to the side. At the same time, his open palm gently touched the flat of her blade. It was not a block. It was a guide. He didn't resist her force. He redirected it. Ghislaine's own immense strength, now unopposed, carried her forward. The greatsword, guided by his hand, slammed into the obsidian floor, burying itself a foot deep with a deafening crack. She was thrown off balance, stumbling forward, her entire right side exposed. Before she could recover, Naruto's hand was on her shoulder. Again, no force, just a gentle push, but it was a push applied to the exact point where her balance was weakest. She tumbled head over heels, landing in an undignified heap 10 feet away. The entire exchange had taken less than 2 seconds. She lay there, stunned, the wind knocked out of her. Your strength is a wild horse, Naruto's calm voice stated from above her. You try to ride it, but you are not its master. It throws you about, and you mistake its violent bucking for your own skill. The tasks I give you, the water, the rocks, the stances, are not chores. They are lessons in control, patience, focus. They are how you learn to tame the horse. Until you do, you cannot hope to learn my sword. Shame, hot and familiar, washed over her. He had defeated her, the mighty warrior, without even trying. He had used her own strength against her as if she were a clumsy child. She got to her feet, her ears flattened against her skull. The defiance was gone, replaced by a grudging, bewildered respect. She looked at her sword, embedded in the unbreakable obsidian, then back at him. How? You see the world as a collection of objects to be struck, Naruto explained, walking back to his spot. I see it as a collection of currents to be navigated. You charged, creating a powerful current of force. I did not stand against it. That would be foolish. I simply stepped out of its path and nudged it in a new direction. You defeated yourself. The first principle of the way of the flowing blade is this: do not fight the current. Become the current. It was then that Ghislaine truly began to learn. Her perspective shifted. The menial tasks were no longer insults. They were puzzles. Fetching water became a lesson in patience and the value of single, focused actions accumulating over time. Polishing the obsidian became a meditation on consistency and perfection in small things. Holding a stance became an exploration of her own body, of how to root herself to the earth, how to let power flow through her without tension. And as her mind changed, so too did the world around her. The Ashen Maw, her prison and training ground, began to transform. The trickle of water she collected each morning grew, slowly but surely, into a steady stream, then a gurgling brook. It carved a path through the obsidian, its sound the first permanent noise in the silent crater. One day, a patch of moss, a vibrant, shocking green, appeared at the edge of the new stream. A week later, a flower bloomed. It was an impossible thing, a blossom of luminous, azure petals that seemed to give off a faint, cool light in the perpetual twilight. It had no scent, but its presence was a promise of life. Naruto never commented on the changes, but Ghislaine knew he was the cause. His dormant power, his Shinra, was leaking into the dead land, revitalizing it. The Ma was becoming a reflection of her own training. From a place of sterile death, life and purpose were emerging. A dojo of polished, petrified wood was erected, seemingly overnight. A waterfall, born from the ever-growing stream, now cascaded down one side of the crater, its roar a constant, soothing presence. The air grew clean and carried the scent of petrichor and the strange, cool light of the azure blossoms. Months bled into one another. Ghislaine's body changed. She grew leaner, the bulky, inefficient muscles of a brawler replaced by the sleek, defined musculature of a true swordmaster. Her movements became more fluid, more economical. She could stand in a low stance for hours, her breathing even, her mind calm. She learned to feel the currents, not just in combat, but in the world around her. She could feel the flow of water in the stream, the slow, patient growth of the moss, the subtle shift of the air before a change in pressure. Naruto called this perception the beginnings of understanding Shinra, the all of creation's forest, the interconnectedness of all things. For her, it was simply magic. He taught her to control her Tuki. He had her channel it not into her fists, but into a single, dead leaf. For weeks, she tried to make it twitch, pouring her energy into it with no result. You are shouting at it, Naruto told her. Tuki is not a command. It is an extension of your will. Do not force the leaf to move. Simply will it to be where you are. One day, after countless failures, she cleared her mind, breathed, and focused. The leaf trembled and floated an inch into the air. The gasp of triumph she let out broke her concentration, and it fell. But she had done it. She had learned control. Finally, the day came when Naruto deemed her ready for the second spar. She stood opposite him in the new dojo, the roar of the waterfall a symphony in the background. She held a simple wooden bakken, as did he. This time, there was no rage in her. No frustration. There was only a calm, focused anticipation. Come, Naruto said. She moved. Her attack was not the reckless charge of before. It was a fluid, probing strike. A feint towards his shoulder that flowed seamlessly into a low sweep aimed at his knee. She was not a boulder anymore. She was a river, seeking the path of least resistance. Naruto smiled. He met her attack, his own bakken moving with an impossible grace. Their wooden swords met with a soft clack. There was no jarring impact. He didn't block her strike. He flowed with it, his bakken sliding along hers, redirecting her momentum, creating a new opening. She adapted instantly, her body twisting, her blade disengaging and coming around in a tight arc aimed at his ribs. What followed was not a fight. It was a dance. For 10 minutes, they moved across the dojo floor, a blur of motion. It was a conversation spoken in the language of wood on wood. Ghislaine attacked, using everything she had learned. She was fast, precise, and powerful, but Naruto was always one step ahead. Not faster, not stronger. Just more aware. He seemed to know what she was going to do before she did. He never used more force than was absolutely necessary. He would turn a deadly thrust into a harmless glancing blow with a flick of his wrist. He would dissipate the energy of a powerful slash with a simple circular motion. She was fighting a master of the current, and he was the ocean itself. She couldn't land a single clean blow. The spar ended when he, in the middle of a complex exchange, simply stepped inside her guard and tapped her gently on the forehead with the tip of his bakken. The entire dojo fell silent, save for the roar of the waterfall. Ghislaine stood frozen, her sword in mid-swing. She had lost. She had been utterly, completely, and gracefully defeated. But this time, there was no shame. There was only awe. She had given it her all, had fought with more skill and precision than she had ever thought possible. And she had seen the goal. She had seen the peak she had to climb, and its name was Naruto. She lowered her bakken and bowed deeply. Thank you for the lesson. Naruto's smile was warm and genuine. Good. You have learned to walk. Now, we will learn to run. The final phase of her initial training began. Naruto started teaching her the true forms, the katas, of the way of the flowing blade. It was a style that defied categorization. It had the aggressive speed and forward pressure of the sword god style, but it lacked its rigidity. It incorporated the fluid, evasive footwork and joint locks of the water-stream rock-smashing fist, but it was far more proactive. And underpinning it all was the principle of Shinra, the constant, 360-degree awareness that allowed for impossible feats of prediction and reaction. He taught her the first form, Silent River, Hidden Stone. It was a defensive kata, focused on yielding, redirection, and finding the opponent's center of balance. He taught her the second form, Riptide's Grasp, a series of binding techniques and disarms that used the opponent's own weapon as a lever against them. Then came the third form, Azure Cascade, the first truly offensive set of movements. It was a relentless, flowing series of slashes and thrusts that never stopped, each movement creating the opening for the next, designed to overwhelm the opponent's ability to think and react. She practiced until her arms felt like lead and her mind was a haze, and then she practiced some more. Naruto was an unforgiving instructor, his corrections precise and relentless. But for the first time in her life, Ghislaine was learning something that resonated with her very soul. This was not the rigid, dogmatic teaching of the Dedoldia. This was a philosophy given a cutting edge. She was not just learning to fight, she was learning a new way to exist. One evening, after a grueling day of practicing the Azure Cascade, Naruto led her to the center of the maw. To the obsidian disk where she had first seen him. It was the only part of the crater that had not changed, remaining a perfect circle of sterile black. Your sword, he said, gesturing to the heavy greatsword she still carried. It is a crude tool. A bludgeon of sharpened iron. It served its purpose, but it is unsuited for the way of the flowing blade. It is a boulder. You now require a river. Naruto placed his hand on the surface of the disk. The Shinra, the azure energy that now filled the oasis, converged on his palm. The obsidian beneath his hand began to glow, the light grow. From a faint pulse to a blinding azure glare. The material softened, losing its solidity, flowing like liquid metal into a pool of shimmering, star-dusted night. Ghislaine watched, mesmerized, as he plunged his other hand into the molten obsidian, his expression one of intense concentration. He drew his hand out, and in it, he held the beginnings of a blade. He molded it with his bare hands, he glowing material responding to his touch, his will. He was not smithing a sword, he was sculpting it. He drew it out into a long, elegant blade, slightly curved like a katana but with the solid, double-edged width of a longsword. He shaped the hilt, the cross guard, the pommel, all from the same seamless, flowing material. He worked in silence, his azure eyes glowing with the same light as the metal he shaped. He held the blade aloft, and whispered words in that same, ancient language she had heard him use to unmake the demon ape. The blade pulsed once, and the light faded. What remained was a masterpiece. It was a sword of pure, polished obsidian, so black it seemed to devour the light. It was not matte like the disc had been, but held a glossy, liquid sheen. Faint, almost invisible striations of deep azure ran through the blackness, like currents in a midnight sea. It was perfectly balanced, radiating a faint, cool energy that resonated with the Tuki she had learned to control. Naruto held it out to her, hilt first. A weapon for a true swordswoman. It is durable as dragon scale, sharp enough to cleave thought, and light enough to dance with the wind. It has no name. A sword's name must be earned by its wielder. Ghislaine reached out with a trembling hand. The moment her fingers touched the hilt, she felt a connection, a hum of energy that flowed up her arm and settled in her heart. It felt like an extension of her own arm, of her own will. She lifted it. It was impossibly light, yet possessed a sense of undeniable substance. She gave it a tentative swing, and it cut through the air with a silent Lethal whisper. She looked from the magnificent blade to Naruto, her amber eyes wide with an emotion she couldn't name. It was gratitude, but it was so much more. It was the feeling of being seen, of being understood, of being given a gift that was not just an object, but a symbol of her own transformation. I don't know what to say, she stammered, for once in her life truly at a loss for words. Naruto simply nodded, the serene, ancient calm returning to his features. He looked at her, standing there with her new sword, her new stance, her new understanding. She was no longer the lost, raging child who had stumbled into his oblivion. She was a warrior, honed and polished, ready to be tempered in the fires of the world. The foundation was laid. The true work was about to begin. A genuine smile, the first she had seen from him that held true warmth, graced his lips. Your training begins now. Chapter 2 End. Chapter 3. An elf, a curse, and a crossroads town. 5 years. 5 years since the day Naruto had placed the nameless obsidian sword in her hands. For Ghislaine Dedoldia, it was a lifetime. The Ashen Maw was no longer a dead place, it was the only true home she had ever known. It was a vibrant, thrumming paradise carved from oblivion, a testament to the quiet, world-altering power of the man who had become the axis of her existence. The waterfall roared a constant, mighty song. The azure blossoms carpeted the crater floor, their cool, gentle light a permanent aurora in the twilight. The air was pure and sweet, and the dojo of petrified Oud stood as a silent monument to her transformation. She had entered the Maw a wounded, raging animal. She now stood as a sword saint, though the title, a rank granted by the world outside, felt laughably inadequate. She had long since mastered the initial forms of the way of the flowing blade. Naruto had guided her through another 9, each more complex and demanding than the last. Her style was a thing of lethal beauty, a seamless blend of aggression and evasion, of absolute control and explosive force. Her perception, honed by years of sensing the Shinra in every leaf and drop of water, as a sphere of awareness that extended far beyond her physical senses. She was no longer a boulder rolling downhill. She was the river itself, capable of being gentle enough to caress a stone or powerful enough to shatter a mountain. Her body was an instrument, her sword an extension of her soul, and her mind, once a chaotic storm of shame and anger, was now a deep, calm lake. The insecurities were not gone, they were scars, reminders of the person she had been, but they no longer controlled her. They had been acknowledged, understood, and mastered, just like any other opponent. She stood on the precipice of the Maw, looking out at the chaotic green expanse of the great forest. Naruto stood beside her, his hands tucked into the pockets of his simple black trousers. He was unchanged. Time, for him, was a concept, not an experience. His sun-kissed hair caught the dim light, and his azure eyes surveyed the world with the same ancient, placid curiosity as always. It is time to leave, he said, his voice a calm statement of fact. Not a suggestion. Ghislaine felt a pang of something she could not immediately identify. It wasn't fear. It was reluctance. A deep-seated unwillingness to abandon this sanctuary. Why? She asked, her voice low. We have everything we need here. A sword that is never drawn rusts in its sheath, Naruto replied, turning his gaze to her. You have honed yourself to a razor's edge, Ghislaine. But an edge is meaningless without something to cut. Your training here is complete. The next phase requires a world full of currents, not the perfect, placid flow of our little garden. He looked back out at the horizon. Besides, he added, a hint of dry amusement in his tone, I am growing curious about what has changed in the last few centuries. And I have a hankering for some decent ramen. The kind made by human hands. Ghislaine couldn't help a small smile. In 5 years, she had learned much about him. She knew of his strange fondness for noodle soup, his penchant for sitting on high places, and the profound, bone-deep loneliness that sometimes emanated from him in the quiet hours of the night. He was a god who had forgotten how to be anything but, yet possessed the all-too-human heart of the mortal life he sometimes alluded to in cryptic stories. She nodded, the reluctance giving way to a new, sharp thrill of anticipation. Where are we going? Let the current decide, he said. We will walk east, towards the central continent. We will find a road, and we will follow it. Their departure was unceremonious. They carried little. Naruto required nothing. And Ghislaine needed only her sword and the clothes on her back. As she took one last look at the azure-lit oasis, she felt a profound sense of gratitude. She was leaving a home, but she was not leaving it alone. She walked out into the great forest, but this time, she was not running from anything. She was walking towards everything. The forest that had once been her personal hell was now merely an obstacle course. Predators that had once been life or death struggles were now dispatched with a single, fluid motion of her black sword. She moved through the undergrowth with a silent grace, her senses mapping the terrain around her, her blade a flicker of midnight that ended threats before they could fully form. Naruto walked beside her, his pace unhurried, his presence so in tune with the world that the forest itself seemed to part for him. After a week of travel, they broke through the final tree line and found themselves on a dusty, well-worn road. It was the first sign of civilization she had seen in 5 years. In the distance, a plume of dust bespoke a large group of travelers. A caravan. "This is our ride," Naruto said, and they began to walk. The caravan was a lumbering, chaotic beast, a microcosm of the world itself. It consisted of a dozen massive, 6-legged pack lizards, each laden with goods, surrounded by a motley collection of merchants, families, and the adventurers hired to protect them. The caravan master was a barrel-chested man named Borin, his face a roadmap of scars and his voice a gravelly roar. He sized them up with a critical eye, his gaze lingering on Ghislaine's beastkin features and the strange, masterwork sword at her hip. "Need a ride to Crimson Crossing?" Borin grunted, spitting a stream of brown tobacco juice. "Cost you 5 Asuran silvers each. And you'll earn your keep. We've got a contract with the Iron Fists, but I've seen bigger parties than this get swallowed whole on this road. More swords are always welcome." Yuto simply smiled and produced the coins, their sheen impossibly bright. Borin's eyes widened slightly at the purity of the silver before he grunted his acceptance. They were in. Life on the caravan was a study in human dynamics. Ghislaine, used to years of solitude with only Naruto for company, found it jarring. The air was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, pack lizards, and cooking fires. The nights were filled with loud stories, drunken singing, and the constant bickering of merchants. The lead merchant, a portly, sweating man named Silas, immediately tried to ingratiate himself with Naruto, seeing the quiet, charismatic man as a potential protector. "A sage such as yourself must find this rough travel quite beneath you," Silas fawned one evening, offering Naruto a cup of wine. "If there is anything you require, anything at all, please do not hesitate to ask." Naruto accepted the wine with a polite nod. "The journey is the destination, Merchant Silas. The quality of the road is irrelevant." His cryptic responses only seemed to convince the merchant of his profound wisdom. Ghislaine drew more wary looks. Her Dedoldia heritage was obvious, and her quiet, intense demeanor was unsettling to most. A few of the hired adventurers, members of the B-rank team, Iron Fists, tried to posture in front of her. One of them, a swaggering spearman with more muscles than sense, cornered her while she was sharpening her blade. "That's a nice sword you got there, cat girl," he said, puffing out his chest. "Bet you don't even know how to use it properly. A big blade like that is just for show. Needs a real man's strength." 5 years ago, Ghislaine would have broken his arm. Now, she didn't even look up from her whetstone. She simply let a minuscule sliver of her controlled Tuki leak out. It wasn't an attack, it was an announcement. The air around her grew heavy, cold, and sharp with killing intent. It was the feeling of standing at the edge of a cliff in a hurricane. The spearman froze, the color draining from his face. His swagger evaporated, replaced by the primal fear of a prey animal that has just realized the nice, quiet cat it was taunting is, in fact, a saber-toothed tiger. He stammered an apology and scrambled away. Naruto, watching from across the campfire, chuckled into his tea. "You've learned restraint," he commented later. "You taught me that a show of force is the tool of the weak," she replied. Her gaze distant. True strength requires no announcement. The days on the road were monotonous, a slow crawl across arid plains under a relentless sun. They dealt with minor threats. A pack of sand stalkers, lizard-like creatures that mimicked the terrain, were dispatched by the Iron Fists with some difficulty. Ghislaine watched, her eyes analytical. They were sloppy, Their teamwork functional but uninspired. They fought like individuals standing near each other, not as a cohesive unit. During one night watch, a lone rock golem ambled towards the camp. Before the alarm could be fully raised, Ghislaine was a black shadow in the moonlight. She didn't meet its ponderous, crushing blows. She flowed around them, her obsidian blade a flicker of light. She didn't try to shatter its stone hide. She struck at its joints, the ankles, the knees, the elbows, with surgical precision. With each strike, she left a deep, clean cut in the magical stone. After a dozen silent, graceful movements, the golem crumbled, falling into its component parts like a poorly made sculpture. She returned to her spot by the fire before most of the caravan had even realized there was a threat. Borin the caravan master watched her with a newfound respect. Silas the merchant looked at her with awe, and the iron fists gave her a very, very wide berth. Her reputation was cemented without her ever raising her voice. She was the silent demon of the caravan, and her quiet companion was the untouchable sage. The attack came on the 10th day, in a wide, rock-strewn valley known as the Wyvern's Gulch. The sky was a vast, unforgiving blue. The first sign of trouble was a series of piercing shrieks from above. Ghislaine was on her feet instantly, her hand on her sword, her eyes scanning the sky. Wyverns! One of the lookouts screamed, his voice cracking with panic. Dozens of them. They descended like a storm, a swarm of leathery wings and snapping jaws. They were green-tailed wyverns. Smaller and faster than their larger cousins, but they hunted in massive packs. There weren't dozens. There were over 100. A wave of panic ripped through the caravan. Merchants screamed and dove for cover. The pack lizards hissed and stamped nervously. Iron fists, formation. The team's leader, a grim-faced woman with a tower shield, yelled. Mages, prepare your barriers. Archers, pick your targets. Chaos erupted. Arrows flew. Spells of fire and ice shot into the sky, but it was like throwing pebbles into a tidal wave. The wyverns descended, snatching at pack lizards, their claws tearing through cargo and flesh alike. The adventurers fought bravely, but they were hopelessly outnumbered. It was in the midst of this chaos that the other S-rank party, who had been keeping to themselves, finally acted. There were 3 of them. A hulking warrior in full plate armor, a lithe female archer with unnervingly sharp eyes, and their leader, an elven woman of impossible beauty. She had long, blonde hair tied in a practical braid, and she moved with a grace that spoke of centuries of combat experience. She wielded 2 short swords, her movements a whirlwind of glittering steel. This was Elinali's Dragonroad and her team, Dragon's Fang. They were magnificent. They fought not as individuals, but as a single, 3-headed beast. The warrior was their anchor, his massive axe cleaving wyverns in 2. The archer was their eyes, her arrows finding the weak points in the creatures, armor with unerring accuracy. And Elinali's was their heart, a whirlwind of death at the center of the storm. She was a master of the sword god style, her attacks blisteringly fast and brutally effective. But even they could not stem the tide. For every wyvern they cut down, 3 more descended. The defensive line was beginning to crumble. Ghislaine looked at Naruto. He was calmly watching the battle, his expression unreadable. He gave her a slight nod. Go, run. It was the permission she had been waiting for. She drew her obsidian blade. She took a deep breath, feeling the shinra of the world around her, the chaotic currents of the battle, the desperate fear of the merchants, the frantic energy of the wyverns. She plunged into the fray. Her entrance was not an explosion. It was an alteration of reality. One moment, a wyvern was diving towards a screaming merchant. The next, its head was tumbling through the air, separated from its body by a silent black line. Ghislaine was already moving, her feet seeming to glide over the rocky ground. She flowed through the battle like water, her blade an extension of her will. She didn't waste a single movement. A thrust through an eye socket here, a slash through a wing joint there, a flowing spin that decapitated 2 beasts at once. The members of Dragon's Fang stared. They had never seen anything like it. Elinali's was a master of the sword god style, a style built on overwhelming speed and single, perfect strikes. This was something else. This beastkin woman fought with the speed of a sword god, the fluidity of a water god, and the predictive, effortless grace of something else entirely. It wasn't a fighting style, it was an art form. She was a dancer. And death was her partner. Ghislaine carved a circle of safety around the core of the caravan. Wyverns fell from the sky like rain, each killed with a single, perfect, economical strike. She was a force of nature, a living embodiment of the way of the flowing blade. But even she had limits. The sheer number of enemies was beginning to wear on her. For every one she killed, more took its place. The sky was still thick with them. And high above, a truly monstrous shape was descending. It was a matriarch wyvern, 3 times the size of the others, its scales the color of obsidian. Its tail tipped with a venomous barb the size of a spear. It let out a roar that shook the very stones of the valley, and dove, not at the defenders, but at the largest of the pack lizards where the merchants, including Silas, were cowering. Ghislaine moved to intercept, but she was too far away, bogged down by a dozen lesser beasts. The dragon's fang warrior charged, his axe raised, but he was too slow. Elinalise cursed and threw one of her swords like a javelin, but it sparked harmlessly off the matriarch's thick scales. It was over. The matriarch's jaws opened, ready to crush the lizard and everyone on it. And then, Naruto acted. He didn't move from his spot beside the lead wagon. He simply lifted a hand, palm facing the sky. Enough, he said. The word was not loud, but it cut through the din of battle like a thunderclap. The Shinra, the ambient energy of the world, answered his call. It was not the violent unmaking in the Ashen Maw. This was controlled, precise, and on a scale that was simply impossible. A dome of pure, shimmering azure energy erupted from the ground, expanding outwards and upwards with incredible speed. It was semi-transparent, like blue-tinted glass, and it enveloped the entire caravan in a perfect, glowing hemisphere. The matriarch slammed into the barrier at full speed. There was no explosion, no resounding crash. The moment its snout touched the azure energy, it began to dissolve, not into dust, but into harmless motes of blue light, like fireflies. Its momentum carried the process through its entire body. In the space of a single second, the terrifying A-rank monster was reduced to a beautiful, silent shower of fading light. The rest of the wyvern flock, seeing their matriarch annihilated, slammed into the barrier in a frenzy. The result was the same. Each one dissolved on contact, their shrieks cut short as they were unmade, their entire ferocious swarm turning into a silent, glittering aurora that washed over the surface of the dome. Within 10 seconds, the sky was empty. The battle was over. The only sound was the wind whistling through the valley and the stunned, disbelieving gasps of the survivors. Naruto lowered his hand. The great azure dome shimmered once, then faded away as if it had never been, leaving behind only the faint scent of ozone and the motes of light dancing in the air. He looked at the chaos. The dead wyverns outside the radius of his barrier, the wounded adventurers, and sighed. Messy, was his only comment. The rest of the journey to Crimson Crossing was conducted in a state of shocked silence. No one spoke to Naruto or Ghislaine. They were no longer the silent demon and the enigmatic sage. They were gods, or monsters, beings who operated on a plane of existence so far removed from ordinary people that even fear felt inadequate. Silas the merchant simply trembled in Naruto's presence. Borin the caravan master chewed his tobacco with a new, frantic energy. And Elinalise Dragonroad watched them. Her sharp elven eyes filled with a burning, unreadable intensity. Crimson Crossing was a riot of noise and color, a sprawling frontier town built at the nexus of several major trade routes. The air was a thick stew of smells. Exotic spices from the east, roasting meat, cheap ale, sweat, and the ever-present dust of the road. The streets were a river of people from every race and nation, burly beastkin, stern dwarves, elegant elves, and a sea of humans. It was a place of opportunity and danger, where fortunes were made and lives were lost with equal ease. As soon as the caravan was safely within the city walls, Naruto and Ghislaine collected their pay from a still trembling Borin and vanished into the crowd, seeking out an inn. Elinalise watched them go, her expression a mixture of awe, suspicion, and a deep, professional curiosity that bordered on obsession. Later that evening, Naruto and Ghislaine were in the common room of a decent inn called the Weary Wanderer. Naruto was, to his delight, enjoying a passable bowl of noodle soup. Ghislaine was cleaning her sword, her presence a bubble of serene deadliness in the raucous room. It was then that Elinalise Dragonroad approached their table. Her 2 companions flanked her, standing a respectful distance away. She had shed her battle-worn armor for a simple but elegant traveling dress. She was smiling, a practiced, charming expression. But her eyes were deadly serious. "That was quite a display in the valley," she said, her voice smooth as silk. "I don't believe I've ever seen barrier magic on that scale. Or a sword style quite like yours," she added, nodding to Ghislaine. "The world is full of surprises," Naruto replied, not looking up from his soup. Elinaliza's smile didn't falter. She leaned forward, placing her hands on their table. Her posture designed to be alluring, to draw the eye. It was a weapon she had wielded for centuries, enhanced by the curse that defined her existence. "My name is Elinalize Dragonroad. My companions and I owe you our thanks. A matriarch wyvern is no small matter. Perhaps we could repay your kindness with a bottle of the finest elven wine. And some private company." Her gaze was locked on Naruto. Her charm active, a palpable force that should have ensnared any mortal man. It washed over Naruto like a gentle breeze. He finally looked up from his bowl, his azure eyes holding no trace of lust, flattery, or even interest. He looked at her, truly looked, and his gaze was not that of a man admiring a beautiful woman. It was the clinical, detached gaze of a master artisan examining a flawed, cracked piece of pottery. "A fascinating affliction," he said, his voice quiet but carrying with absolute clarity. "A parasite of fate woven into your very soul. It feeds on the life force of others through physical contact, and in return, it compels you to seek them out, lest it consume you instead. It must be terribly lonely." The charming smile on Elinaliza's face shattered. It didn't just falter. It broke into a million pieces, replaced by an expression of pure, unadulterated shock. Her hands flew back from the table as if it were white-hot. Her companions tensed, their hands moving towards their weapons. For the first time in centuries, someone had seen through her performance, past her beauty, past her reputation, and had looked directly at the ugly, secret truth of her curse. And he had not done so with disgust or pity, but with a simple, devastatingly accurate observation. She stared at him, her mind reeling. Who was this man? He wielded power that dwarfed archmages, traveled with a swordswoman whose skill defied the known styles, and could see the nature of a divine curse with a single glance. "Who? What are you?" she whispered, her voice stripped of all its artifice. Naruto finished his soup, placing the bowl down with a soft click. He looked at the stunned elf, a flicker of something ancient and sad in his eyes. He saw not an S-rank adventurer, but a prisoner on a leash of centuries, forced to run a race with no finish line. "I am a traveler," he said, "and I am looking for a good map of the northern continent. They say the ramen in the Millis Holy Kingdom is second to none." Elinalize stared for a long moment, her brain working furiously. This man was an anomaly, an outside context problem, of the highest order. Traveling with him would be dangerous, unpredictable, and it might be the only chance she ever had of understanding, or perhaps even breaking, the curse that had ruled her life. The potential reward was worth any risk. She took a deep breath, her composure returning, but her smile was different now. It was genuine, sharp, and stripped of all flirtation. It was the smile of a true adventurer who has just found the dungeon of a lifetime. "We are also heading north," she said, her voice firm. "We know the roads. We have maps. Perhaps we could travel together. For safety." The offer was a lie, and they both knew it. This wasn't about safety. It was about proximity to a miracle or a catastrophe. Naruto glanced at Ghislaine, who simply shrugged. The currents of the world were growing more interesting. He looked back at Elinalize, a true, amused smile touching his lips. "The more, the merrier," he said. "The road is long." Chapter 3 End. Chapter 4. The Hallowed Halls and the Silent Prodigy. The R.O.A.D. north from Crimson Crossing was a different beast from the savage wilds of the Demon Continent. Here, civilization had laid its claim, taming the land into submission. The dusty track widened into a proper, stone-paved road, and the scattered, desperate caravans were replaced by the steady traffic of merchant wagons, traveling nobles, and organized patrols. The landscape softened from arid plains into rolling green hills and orderly swaths of farmland. Yet, for all its tameness, the journey was charged with a new kind of tension, one that emanated from the dynamics of their expanded group. Elinali's Dragonroad was a persistent, intelligent predator in the art of conversation. Her two companions, the stoic, mountain-like warrior named Gustav and the sharp-eyed archer Lyra, were content to observe. But Elinali's herself orbited Naruto like a moon, constantly probing his defenses with casual questions and witty observations. She no longer employed the facade of seduction. That weapon had been proven useless. Instead, she used her keen, centuries-old intellect, trying to piece together the puzzle he represented. So, that barrier, she began one afternoon as they rode, her tone light and conversational. It didn't feel like any school of magic I know. Divine magic barriers are typically golden and opaque, and elemental barriers have tells. A water barrier shimmers, a wind barrier whistles. Yours was silent and absolute. Is it a lost art? Naruto, who had been observing the patterns of bird flight, turned his placid gaze on her. All things that exist are made of the same essence, Lady Elinali's. A wall of stone and a wall of water are merely different expressions of that essence. A wall of pure will is simply a more direct application. It is not an art. It is a fact. Her brow furrowed. His answers were always like this. Simple, profound, and utterly unhelpful. It was like trying to chart the ocean by interviewing a single wave. He never lied, she was certain of that. But he spoke from a perspective so vast it rendered her questions meaningless. The tension between Elinali's and Ghislaine was of a different sort. It was the friction of two master swordswomen from opposing schools of thought, circling each other with professional respect and a healthy dose of rivalry. Elinali's, a true sword god practitioner, was all about overwhelming, decisive offense. Ghislaine's way of the flowing blade was a deeper, more holistic philosophy. One evening, Gustav, the hulking warrior, was struggling to dislodge the axle of a wagon that had gotten stuck in a muddy ditch. After several minutes of fruitless heaving, Ghislaine walked over. She didn't try to lift it. She studied the angle, the distribution of weight, the suction of the mud. Then, she placed her hands on the wagon, not to lift, but to push at a precise, downward angle while simultaneously kicking a rock under the opposite wheel. The wagon shifted, the axle popped free with a wet squelch. It was a perfect application of leverage and understanding of force. Elinali's, watching from the side, raised an eyebrow. Clever. A sword god practitioner would have simply cut the wagon in half and called it a day. Ghislaine wiped the mud from her hands. A sword is for cutting your enemies, not for solving your problems. My master taught me that true strength is knowing which tool to use, and when the best tool is not a tool at all. It was a small moment, but it marked a shift. A grudging respect began to form between them, the acknowledgement of two different but equally valid paths to mastery. Ghislaine saw in Elinali's a formidable warrior trapped by a cruel fate. Elinali's saw in Ghislaine a level of skill and discipline that was nearly supernatural, a product of the enigmatic man she followed. After 2 weeks of travel, they crested a hill, and the magic city of Ranoa spread out before them. It was nothing like the chaotic, dusty sprawl of Crimson Crossing. Ranoa was a city born of intellect and order. Its walls were smooth, white stone, unmarked by time or battle, with glowing blue runes etched into them at regular intervals, humming with a barely perceptible energy. The buildings within were tall and elegant, constructed with a geometric perfection that defied traditional masonry. Towers of polished marble and obsidian spiraled towards the sky, connected by gracefully arching bridges of solidified light. The air was clean and cool, carrying the faint, crisp scent of ozone and the smell of old parchment that seemed to seep from the very stones. At the city's heart, a colossal structure of crystal and white stone dominated the skyline, the Ranoa University of Magic, the most respected institution of magical learning in the world. Their arrival at the city gates was met with a more formal scrutiny than they had experienced before. The guards were not grizzled warriors, but sharp-eyed mages in pristine blue robes. A crystal orb at the gate pulsed with light as they passed, registering their magical potential. When Naruto walked through, the orb flared with a brilliant, blinding white light before cracking down the middle with a sharp ping. The guards stared, speechless. Their professional calm shattered. Naruto didn't seem to notice, continuing his placid walk into the city. Elinali's smoothly intervened, using her S-rank credentials and a hefty pouch of gold to smooth things over, explaining him away as an eccentric sage with poor energy control. It was a flimsy excuse, but it was enough to get them through the gate. The news of their arrival, and the shattered mana meter, spread through the university like wildfire. By the time they had secured rooms at a quiet, scholarly inn called the Quill and Cauldron, a formal invitation had already arrived, delivered by a floating clockwork automaton. It was an invitation to attend a colloquium at the university the following day, extended by the Dean of Thaumaturgy himself. "It seems your lack of subtlety has preceded us," Elinalise remarked dryly, looking at the elegant parchment. "It is difficult to hide the sun," Naruto replied simply. "One can only hope the local astronomers are open-minded." The lecture hall was a grand amphitheater of tiered seats, all carved from a single, continuous piece of white marble. The air hummed with latent magic and intellectual fervor. Every seat was filled with the faculty of the university. Aging archmages with beards that reached their belts, sharp-eyed young instructors, and visiting scholars from across the continents. At the front, a panel of the university's most esteemed figures sat behind a long table. Among them was the dean, a man whose magical aura was a deep and powerful ocean, and beside him, a woman who seemed small in comparison, but whose presence was just as noteworthy. She was a demon of the metered tribe, with deep blue hair tied back in neat braids, a pointed hat, and intelligent, focused eyes. This was Roxy Megardia. She was not a department head or a dean. She was a professor of intermediate elementalism, a well-respected but not senior position. However, her research on mana flow anomalies had made her the university's foremost expert on unconventional magic. It was she who had insisted the sage who broke the gate orb be invited. She felt an academic thrill that bordered on giddiness. This was an unknown, a varia, BLE that could challenge the very foundations of their understanding. The colloquium began, a dry and formal affair. Mages presented their research on familiar topics, optimizing the burn rate of a fireball incantation, the resonant frequencies of earth magic, the metaphysics of the divine school. Naruto listened patiently, his expression one of serene interest. Ghislaine sat beside him, looking profoundly bored, while Elinalise and her companions watched from the upper tiers, curious to see how he would handle this new kind of battlefield. Finally, the Dean of Thaumaturgy, Archmage Valerius, a man with a booming voice and an air of absolute authority, addressed Naruto. "Sage Naruto, we are honored by your presence. We are given to understand that you possess a unique and potent energy. Would you care to share your thoughts on the classical six-element model of magic?" Naruto stood. A hush fell over the hall. He walked to the center of the stage, his simple black and white clothes a stark contrast to the ornate robes around him. "Your model is not wrong," Naruto began, his voice calm and clear, reaching every corner of the hall without any magical amplification. "It is merely incomplete. It is a man describing a tree by observing only 6 of its leaves, while ignoring the branch, the trunk, and the roots that give it life." A murmur went through the crowd. Valerius frowned, his pride pricked. "Incomplete. The 6 elements, fire, water, wind, earth, alongside the divine and healing schools, have been the bedrock of magical theory for millennia. They describe every known phenomenon." "Do they?" Naruto asked gently. He held up a hand. A perfect sphere of shimmering, multicolored light appeared in his palm. It wasn't fire, or water, or wind. It was all of them and none of them, a swirling vortex of pure energy. "What element is this?" "It is hot, like fire. It flows, like water. It has pressure, like wind. It has substance, like earth. It heals, as I could demonstrate by passing it through a wounded man. It is a pure expression of intent. The elements you study are merely the crudest, most easily accessible dialects of the true language of creation." Roxy Megardia leaned forward, her eyes wide, her pen scribbling furiously on a notepad. "He's not using a mana circle. There's no incantation. It's pure will-based manifestation. And your incantations," Naruto continued, gesturing to the hall at large. "You believe the words themselves hold power. They do not. They are a focusing tool. A mental scaffold. You are shouting a set of instructions at the universe in the hope that it will listen. A true master does not shout at his tools. He becomes one with them. He does not need to tell the river to flow, he simply shows it the path." This was heresy. Archmage Valerius stood up, his face red. "You speak blasphemy, sir. Without the sacred words passed down from the first mages, mana is a chaotic, untamable force. To suggest otherwise is the height of arrogance. Is it? Naruto's gaze swept the room. Calm and unassailable, or is it the height of arrogance to believe that the infinite, complex machinery of the universe can only be operated by a few specific phrases you happen to write down? He looked directly at Roxy, seeing not just a demon, but a truly inquisitive mind, a rare gem amongst the stones of dogma. Professor Megardia, you have studied mana flow anomalies. Tell me, what is the purpose of the vocal component in a spell like Icicle Edge? Roxy was startled to be addressed directly. She stood, her voice clear and precise. The vocal component, O frigid spear of winter's heart, serves to attune the caster's mana to the elemental frequency of ice while shaping the intent into a projectile form. It's a standard resonance focusing incantation. Correct. Naruto nodded. It is a recipe. You are telling your mana what you want it to become. But what if your mana already knows? He flicked his wrist. A dozen shimmering spears of pure, cold energy materialized in the air around him. They were not made of frozen water. They were woven from the very concept of cold itself, far sharper and denser than any normal icicle. They hung there, silent and deadly, a testament to a power that did not need instructions. The hall was utterly silent. The archmages stared, their faces a mixture of shock, outrage, and dawning, terrifying comprehension. Roxy sat down slowly, her heart pounding with the thrill of discovery. This man had just rewritten the entire textbook. He wasn't describing a new school of magic. He was describing the source code. While the academic world of Ranoa was being turned on its head, Naruto's attention had also been caught by something far quieter. During a tour of the university grounds, he had noticed a lone student practicing in a secluded courtyard. She was a young half-elf with short, vibrant green hair and the large, pointed ears of her elven heritage. She was attempting to cast a simple waterball spell, but she was doing it without an incantation. Her hands moved in a complex, intuitive pattern, her brow furrowed in concentration. A sphere of water would form, wobble unsteadily, and then collapse with a splash. A group of other students watched from a distance, whispering and snickering. There's the mute caster. Freak. It's unnatural. My father says half-breeds are always mongrels, never pure in blood or magic. The girl, Sylphiette, heard them. She flinched, her shoulders hunching, her concentration broken. The fear and shame that radiated from her were a bitter, familiar taste to Naruto's senses. He had felt that same sting of ostracization a lifetime ago, in a village of orange and green. Later, he sought her out. He found her in a quiet corner of the great library, supposedly reading a book. But he could see she was just hiding. He approached her table, his presence calm and non-threatening. Sylphiette, he said softly. She jumped, her eyes wide with fear, as if expecting another taunt. When she saw him, the strange, powerful sage everyone was talking about, her fear only intensified. She curled in on herself, making herself smaller. Please. I wasn't doing anything, she stammered. Her voice barely a whisper. I know, Naruto said, his voice gentle. He pulled up a chair and sat down, keeping a comfortable distance. I saw you practicing earlier. Your voiceless casting. It is very beautiful. Sylphie stared at him, bewildered. Beautiful. Everyone had always called it wrong, broken, or unnatural. But it doesn't work right. It's unstable. As a bird's first flight unstable. Naruto asked, does that make the act of flying wrong? Or does it simply mean the wings need to grow stronger? He leaned forward slightly, his azure eyes soft and kind. His own senses, his eyes of the Azure Emperor, had seen what the others could not. When she cast, her mana didn't follow the clumsy, blocky pathways dictated by incantations. It wove itself into elegant, complex tapestries of energy. It was an intuitive, raw, and profoundly advanced form of magic. She wasn't a broken mage. She was a prodigy who had been told her gift was a flaw. The others, they use words, he explained. Words are like a cage for their magic. A cage gives it shape and stops it from running wild. You do not build a cage. You are teaching your magic to fly free. It is a much harder path, but its potential is limitless. The instability you feel is not failure. It is the turbulence of learning to soar without a cage. Tears welled in Sylphiette's eyes. This powerful, Incredible Man was not mocking her. He was validating her. He understood. For the first time, someone understood. How? How do I make it stronger? She whispered. You do not make it stronger. You allow it to be, he said. He guided her through a simple meditation, a technique he had taught Ghislaine years ago. It was about feeling the Shinra, the life force within herself, and letting it find its own equilibrium. Do not force your magic. Listen to it. It is a part of you. Let it be your partner, not your servant. He left her there, amidst the towering shelves of books, with a gift more valuable than any spell, a new perspective. He had not fixed her problem, but had given her the confidence to fix it herself. The seed of a deep, powerful devotion had been planted in the heart of the silent prodigy. The climax of his visit to Ranoa came the next day. Roxy, her mind still reeling from his lecture, had practically begged him for a practical demonstration. She wanted to record and analyze his energy output in a controlled environment. He agreed, amused by her scholarly fervor. They went to one of the university's largest testing chambers, a vast, domed room shielded by layers of powerful defensive runes. The dean and a few other senior mages, along with Elinolise and a very curious Sylphie, were there to observe. I propose a joint experiment, Professor Dedoldia, Naruto said. You believe incantations are necessary. I believe they are a crutch. Let us see if we can build a bridge between our two philosophies. His proposal was simple. Roxy would perform the incantation for a high-level wind spell, Tempest Sphere. A notoriously difficult spell to control. At the same time, Naruto would use no incantation, but would instead provide the raw power and a framework of will to contain it. Roxy was nervous but thrilled. She stood in the center of the chamber and began the incantation, her voice ringing with power. O winds of the heavens, O breath of the world, gather and turn, a maelstrom unfurled. Let the sky's fury be given a form, I call upon the heart of the storm. As she spoke, the mana in the room began to churn violently, a chaotic vortex of wind that threatened to tear itself apart. This was the normal, dangerous phase of the spell, where the casters will fought to contain the raw element. But then Naruto acted. He raised a hand, and his Shinra, his calm azure energy, flowed into the nascent storm. It did not suppress the chaos. It embraced it. He wove a container of pure will around the raging winds, a flexible, dynamic cage that bent and flowed with the storm's fury instead of rigidly opposing it. He then began to feed the system, introducing new currents. A current of moisture drawn from the air. A current of electrical charge, creating flashes of miniature lightning. A current of pressure differential, causing the sphere to rotate with terrifying speed. The result was impossible. Inside the testing chamber, a perfect, self-sustaining miniature storm system had formed. It was a swirling gray sphere the size of a house, crackling with blue lightning, its winds howling in a controlled, stable vortex. It was a living tempest, bound and held in PLA. CE by the effortless will of one man and the vocal trigger of one woman. It was a perfect fusion of their two methods. The observers were speechless. Elinolise stared, realizing the barrier in the valet had been a mere parlor trick compared to this. The dean's jaw was slack, his millennia of magical dogma lying in ruins at his feet. Sylphie watched with tears in her eyes, seeing the living proof of what Naruto had told her, magic that was alive, free, and beautiful. And Roxy Dedoldia looked at the controlled, beautiful, terrifying storm, then at the calm, smiling man who had co-created it, and she felt a sensation that went beyond academic curiosity. It was awe, it was reverence, and it was the dawning realization that her lifelong quest for knowledge had just found its ultimate destination. Naruto lowered his hand, and the storm peacefully dissipated into a cool breeze and a shower of harmless sparks, leaving the chamber silent once more. He looked at the stunned faces around him and gave a small, satisfied nod. He had come to Ranoa looking for a map, but he had found something more. He had found 2 more lost souls, 2 more potential students, 2 more currents to add to the growing river of his new destiny. Chapter 4 End. Chapter 5. The Dance of Lions in a Gilded Cage. The news arrived in Australia not as a formal report, but as a tremor. It was a ripple in the placid, treacherous waters of the court. A whispered rumor that quickly gained the unstoppable momentum of truth. A sage of impossible power had manifested in Ranoa. He had shattered the university's monometer, dismantled centuries of magical dogma in a single lecture, and, with the aid of a Megaridian professor, created a contained thunderstorm within a testing chamber as a mere demonstration. The story was fantastical, absurd, and, according to the frantic, magically encrypted reports from Asura's spies in the Magic City, entirely true. In the Vestra family estate, a place of faded opulence where the scent of jasmine from the gardens couldn't quite mask the underlying decay of political influence, this news was received not with awe, but with cold, calculating precision. For House Vestra, once a roaring lion of the Asuran court, now a cornered animal facing dwindling prestige and mounting debts, this, Azure Sage, was not a miracle. He was a resource, a key, a weapon. Lady Serafina Vestra, youngest daughter of the House Patriarch, stood before a vast, Mercator-style map of the six-faced world pinned to the wall of her personal study. Her fingers, adorned with a single, unadorned silver ring, traced the road from Ranoa. She was a woman carved from ivory and shadow, her beauty a sharp, intelligent thing rather than a soft, decorative one. Her hair was the color of spun silver, coiled in an intricate, severe style that bespoke her station. Her eyes, the gray of a winter sky, missed nothing. Where others saw a world of nations and peoples, Serafina saw a game board. Every city was a square, every army a piece, every political marriage a gambit. Her family was losing the game, badly. He calls himself Naruto, her brother, Lord Cassian, said from behind her. He was a man who wore his ambition like an ill-fitting suit. His handsome face marred by a perpetual sneer of discontent. Travels with an S-rank party, Dragon's Fang, and a beastkin swordswoman of terrifying skill. The Ranoa mages are calling him a living god. Preposterous. Is it? Serafina's voice was low and melodic, yet held the cold chime of steel. She turned from the map, her gray eyes locking onto her brother's. A man who can rewrite the laws of magic at a whim is, for all practical purposes, a god. And a god is the most powerful piece one can place on the board. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle in the silent room. House Boreas grows stronger every day, their alliance with the royal family solidifies. House Greyrit plays its own inscrutable games in the background. We are being bled dry, Cassian. Our coffers are low, our political allies are abandoning us. We need a miracle, and the world has just delivered one to our doorstep. Cassian scoffed. And how do you propose we acquire this, god? He is in Ranoa, surrounded by mages who would dissect their own mothers for a new theory. He holds all the power. Power is not the same as influence, Serafina countered, her mind already 3 steps ahead. He has the former in abundance, but the latter. In Asura, influence is the true currency. We will not try to match his power. We will offer him what he does not have: legitimacy, status. A place within the gilded cage of our society. We will flatter him, indebt him, bind him to our cause with silks and silver until he is our lion, ready to be unleashed upon our enemies. Her plan was audacious, arrogant, and utterly Asuran. It was the only move they had left. And so, a formal invitation was drafted. It was a masterpiece of courtly language, penned on the finest vellum. Sealed with the Vestra family crest of a roaring lion. It spoke of admiration for the sage's profound wisdom, of a desire to foster greater understanding between the martial might of Asura and the arcane knowledge of Ranoa. It was an invitation to be celebrated, to be honored, to be a guest of the highest esteem in the royal capital. It was a beautiful, silken net. Lady Serafina Vestra herself would lead the delegation to deliver it. It was a task that required a surgeon's touch, not a butcher's cleaver, and she was the finest surgeon in her house. The departure from Ranoa had been a spectacle. Roxy Megardia, armed with a fresh research grant and the full, if bewildered, blessing of the university, had formally requested to join Naruto's retinue as a field researcher. Sylphiette, her confidence blossoming under Naruto's quiet encouragement, had found the courage to petition for a leave of absence to continue her alternative studies under his direct tutelage. The university, hurried to keep any connection to the man who had shaken their world, had agreed to everything. Thus, their party had grown, now a strange and potent collection of warriors, mages, and a being who defied all categorization. They were a week out from Ranoa when the Vestra delegation found them. It was an impressive sight. a dozen knights in gleaming silver plate, their tabards bearing the roaring lion. Flanking a luxurious carriage that was itself a work of art. Serafina descended from the carriage, a vision of noble grace. She moved with a practiced poise that made it clear she was the one in command. She presented the invitation to Naruto with a flawless bow, her gray eyes assessing him, cataloging him. She saw a man of unassuming appearance but with a presence that felt like the stillness at the heart of a hurricane. She felt no magical aura from him, no palpable tuki. It was like looking at a void, a hole in the world that all power seemed to flow into, rather than out of. It was deeply unsettling. Naruto accepted the scroll, his expression one of polite amusement. He read it, his azure eyes scanning the flowery prose. Elinalize, Roxy, and Ghislaine stood behind him, their guards up. They had all traveled enough to know that an invitation this ornate from an Asuran noble house was never just an invitation. House Vestra does us a great honor, Naruto said, his voice betraying nothing. We would be delighted to accept your hospitality. Serafina's smile was a small, perfect thing. The first step was a success. He had taken the bait. Excellent. The royal capital of Asuria awaits you, great sage. We have prepared accommodations befitting your station. My family is eager to learn from your wisdom. The journey to Asuria was Serafina's opening gambit. She engaged Naruto in conversation. Her intellect a sharp, glittering thing. She spoke of politics, of history, of philosophy. She painted a picture of the Asuran court as a place of culture and enlightenment, a center of civilization. She was testing his intelligence, his ego, his desires. She sought a crack in his armor, a weakness she could exploit. She found none. He listened patiently, his azure eyes holding a deep, ancient amusement. He responded to her complex political theories with simple, almost childlike parables that somehow dismantled her entire argument. He showed no desire for wealth, no hunger for fame, no thirst for power. When she spoke of the glory of the Asuran kingdom, he would ask about the state of the crops in the fields they passed. When she detailed the intricate lineage of the royal family, he would comment on the clever design of a bridge they were crossing. He was utterly immune to the lures she presented. It was like trying to catch a fish that lived in the sky. Her frustration mounted, a cold, unfamiliar feeling. She was used to being the smartest person in the room, the one who pulled the strings. With Naruto, she felt like a child playing a board game with a grandmaster who had already seen every possible move she could make. Asuria, when they arrived, was a breathtaking monument to power and wealth. The city was a symphony of white marble and gold leaf, its towers piercing the sky. Manicured parks and grand boulevards bustled with nobles in fine silks and soldiers in polished armor. The air itself felt different, heavy, perfumed, and thick with tea. The unspoken weight of centuries of tradition and intrigue. This was the gilded cage Serafina had spoken of, and it was more magnificent and more suffocating than one could imagine. The Vestra estate was a microcosm of the city. Servants bowed at every corner. The rooms they were given were opulent to the point of absurdity, filled with priceless art, furniture of rare woods, and beds so soft one could drown in them. A banquet was held in their honor that first night. The food was a parade of exotic dishes, the wine was the finest vintage, and the guests were a carefully curated collection of Asura's most influential figures. It was another test. The nobles descended on their party like well-dressed wolves. They flattered Naruto, trying to draw him into conversations about his power, to gauge if he could be bought or controlled. They condescended to Ghislaine, treating her as little more than an exotic pet, a powerful guard dog. They flirted with Elinalize, seeing her as a beautiful prize to be won. They tried to engage Roxy in academic debate, seeking to belittle her Megardian heritage and provincial university. They ignored Sylphie completely. The members of Naruto's party handled it in their own ways. Elinalize turned the flirtations back on the nobles with a practiced, predatory grace that left them flustered and confused. Roxy dismantled their arguments with a calm, logical precision that left them speechless. Ghislaine's silent, cold glare was enough to deter any who got too close. Sylphie, terrified, simply clung to Naruto's side. Naruto himself was the picture of serene calm. He navigated the treacherous social waters with an ease that baffled Serafina, who was watching his every move. He deflected compliments, ignored veiled insults, and treated the most powerful duke with the same polite Detached courtesy as he did the servant filling his wine glass. He was an immovable object, an unreadable book. The days that followed were a subtle, undeclared war. Serafina orchestrated a grand tour of the capital for them. She showed them the royal treasury, a vault overflowing with gold and jewels, hoping to tempt him with wealth. Naruto commented on the impressive masonry of the vault's door. She took them to the royal arena, to witness the kingdom's finest knights in combat, hoping to awe him with martial prowess. Naruto pointed out that the Nai's footwork was inefficient and would leave them vulnerable to a faster opponent. She arranged a private audience with her father, Lord Vestra, a man whose political cunning was legendary. Lord Vestra offered Naruto titles, land, a permanent position as the court's resident sage, a golden leash. Naruto politely declined, stating that he was merely a traveler and had no desire for such anchors. Every ploy failed, every gambit was effortlessly deflected. Serafina felt a growing sense of desperation. Her family's future rested on her ability to ensnare this man, and he was proving to be utterly beyond her grasp. Worse, she found herself becoming fascinated. She had never met anyone like him. He saw through the entire charade of her society, the intricate dance of power and pride, and he simply wasn't impressed. He looked at her world of gilded cages and saw only the bars. The culmination of her family's scheme was to be a grand ball, held in the royal palace itself, in honor of their mysterious guests. It was the talk of the capital. Everyone who was anyone would be there. And it was here that the final, most dangerous part of the Vestra plan would be enacted. The ballroom was a cavern of light and sound. Thousands of enchanted candles floated near the impossibly high, frescoed ceiling, casting a warm, golden glow on the sea of nobles below. An orchestra played a soaring waltz. The air was a cacophony of laughter, whispered gossip, and the clinking of crystal glasses. Serafina, dressed in a magnificent gown of silver silk that shimmered like moonlight on water, felt a knot of ice in her stomach. Tonight, the game would end, one way or another. Her family's plan was as simple as it was ruthless. A rival noble, Duke Boreas, their family's primary political opponent, would be the target. During the height of the ball, a Vestra agent, a disgraced knight with a grudge, would attempt to assassinate the Duke. The agent would be armed with a kunai of a distinctive, foreign design. A weapon they had observed Naruto's companions carrying. The attempt would, of course, be foiled by the Vestra family's own guards, who were conveniently placed nearby. The assassin would be killed before he could talk. The evidence would be clear. The foreign sage's people had attempted to sow chaos in the Asuran court. House Vestra would be lauded as heroes who had saved the Duke, their political rival, from the treacherous outsiders. The king, indebted to them, would have no choice but to place Naruto and his party under their protection, which would be nothing less than house arrest. They would have their god in a cage. Serafina found Naruto standing on a balcony overlooking the royal gardens, away from the noise of the ballroom. He was looking up at the stars, a faint, sad smile on his lips. "In my old home, the stars were different," he said, without turning to look at her. "It is strange to be so far from the sky, you know." His comment was so unexpected, so personal, that it momentarily disarmed her. "I have never known any other sky," she replied, her voice softer than she intended. She came to stand beside him at the railing. "That is the nature of a cage," he said gently. "You do not realize you are in one until you see the world outside." He finally turned to look at her, and his azure eyes held no judgment, only a profound, weary sadness, as if he were looking at a beautiful bird that had forgotten it had wings. "You play such intricate games inside this beautiful prison, Lady Serafina. You scheme and you plot, you move your pieces on the board, and you call it power. Have you ever wondered what the sky looks like from the outside?" Her breath caught in her throat. He saw it. He saw everything. He saw her ambition, her desperation, the gilded bars of the cage she called her life. His question was not an accusation. It was a genuine inquiry, and it struck her with the force of a physical blow. It was a question she had never dared to ask herself. Before she could respond, a scream erupted from the ballroom behind them. The music screeched to a halt. The dance of lions had begun. Serafina's heart pounded. This was it. She rushed back into the ballroom, Naruto following calmly behind her. A circle had formed around Duke Boreas, a portly man whose face was now pale with terror. Before him stood a knight in dark, unmarked armor, a wicked-looking kunai in his hand. Vestra guards were already moving in, swords drawn, playing their part perfectly. "Traitor!" the captain of the Vestra guard shouted. "Lay down your weapon." The assassin, his face hidden by his helm, merely laughed, a rough, ugly sound. He lunged towards the Duke. But the script suddenly, violently, deviated from the plan. A blur of black and gold intercepted the assassin. It was Ghislaine. She had been standing near the wall, observing, and had moved with a speed that was simply not human. Her obsidian blade was not drawn. She met the assassin's charge, her body flowing around his clumsy lunge. Her hand chopped down on his wrist, and the sound of bone snapping echoed in the silent hall. The kunai clattered to the floor. With her other hand, she struck 2 precise points on his neck. And the assassin collapsed, unconscious but alive. It was over in less than 3 seconds. Simultaneously, on the other side of the circle, another Vestra agent, a man disguised as a palace servant, drew a poisoned dagger, preparing to save the Duke from a second, unseen threat. Before he could even take a step, his wrist was caught in an unbreakable grip. Elinali's Dragonroad smiled at him, a charming, deadly smile. "I don't think so, darling," she whispered, twisting his arm behind his back with practiced ease, her other hand deftly plucking the dagger from his grasp. Panic erupted. The plan was in shambles. The assassins were captured, alive. Lord Vestra, his face a mask of fury and disbelief, acted quickly. "Seize them," he roared at the royal knights, pointing a trembling finger at Ghislaine and Elinali's. "They are in league with this filth. They attack a noble of the realm." The royal knights, confused but sworn to obey the orders of high nobility, began to advance, their swords drawn. The ballroom was on the verge of erupting into a bloodbath. It was then that Naruto finally acted. He didn't move from the entrance to the balcony. He didn't raise his voice. He simply clapped his hands together once. The sound was not loud, but it resonated through the very bones of every person in the hall. A wave of pure, absolute calm washed over the room. The panic, the anger, the fear, it all vanished, replaced by a profound, inexplicable tranquility. The advancing knights stopped in their tracks, their aggression gone. Lord Vestra's mouth hung open, his rage stolen from him. "Now," Naruto's voice cut through the silence, calm and authoritative. "Let us put the pieces back on the board correctly." He gestured to the unconscious assassin Ghislaine had subdued. "This man is Sir Kale, a former knight of House Vestra, dismissed 5 years ago for unbecoming conduct. He holds a deep grudge against his former masters, but a deeper loyalty to the gold they pay him." He then pointed to the man Elinali's held. "And this man is an agent of the Vestra household guard, known for his skill with poisons. A curious man to have serving drinks, is he not?" A low murmur went through the crowd of nobles. They were not fools. They could see the shape of the plot now that it was laid bare. Naruto's gaze finally settled on Lord Vestra, and for the first time, his azure eyes held a chill. It was the cold, bottomless chill of the deepest ocean. "You sought to use me as a piece in your game, Lord Vestra. You sought to put a leash on me. You have made a grave miscalculation. You have mistaken the sky for a ceiling." He turned his gaze back to Serafina. She stood frozen, her face pale, her carefully constructed world shattered around her. He had not just defeated her family. He had done it without lifting a finger, using nothing but the truth and the sheer force of his presence. He had exposed their desperate, ugly little scheme to the entire world. He walked over to her. His footsteps the only sound in the vast, silent ballroom. He stopped before her, ignoring the stunned nobles, the captured assassins, her ruined father. He looked at her not with anger, not with triumph, but with that same, unnerving pity he'd shown in the garden. He lowered his voice so only she could hear. "The cage door is open, Lady Vestra," he said, his voice a soft, devastating whisper. "The sky is waiting. The only question is whether you have the courage to fly." He then turned and walked away, his companions falling into step behind him, parting the sea of stunned nobles like a ship through water. They walked out of the ballroom, out of the palace, leaving the ruins of House Vestra and a single, shattering question hanging in the air behind them. Chapter 5 End. Chapter 6. Scars of a Sunlit Past. Their exit from Asurlia was not an escape, it was a pronouncement. They walked from the palace not as fugitives, but as judges who had passed sentence and found the entire system wanting. The royal knights, still dazed by the wave of enforced tranquility that had washed over them, simply parted, their instincts screaming that to impede these beings would be a form of suicide. Naruto led the way, his expression as serene as ever, but the silence that surrounded their group was more profound than any threat. Ghislaine walked at his right, her hand resting on the hilt of her obsidian sword. Her amber eyes sweeping the crowd with cold lethality. Elinalise strolled on his left, a playful, dangerous glint in her eyes, as if she had just witnessed the most entertaining theater of her long life. Roxy and Sylphie followed close behind, their own auras of magical power a clear warning. They were nearly at the palace gates when a single figure, a flash of silver silk in the torchlight, broke away from the stunned court and ran after them. It was Serafina. She was stripped of her poise, her intricate hairstyle coming undone, her perfect gown now looking like a costume she was desperate to shed. She stopped a few feet from their group, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her gray eyes wide with a terrifying mixture of desperation and resolve. Ghislaine turned, placing herself between Serafina and Naruto, a low growl rumbling in her chest. "The game is over, noble," she snarled. "Go back to your cage." Serafina flinched but held her ground. Her gaze was fixed on Naruto. She had no plan, no strategy. For the first time in her life, she was acting on pure, unadulterated impulse. Her family was ruined. Her name was disgraced. Her entire world, the intricate game board she had mastered, had been flipped over and set ablaze. The only thing left in the smoking ruin was his final question, the offer of a sky she'd never seen. "Take me with you," she said, the words raw and unpolished. Stripped of all her courtly artifice. It was not a demand or a negotiation. It was a plea. Elinalise raised a perfectly sculpted eyebrow. "My dear, I think you find our accommodations somewhat lacking in servants and silken sheets. We're fresh out of gilded cages." Serafina ignored her, her focus unwavering. "I have nothing left here. You showed me the bars. I cannot unsee them now. Please." Naruto stopped and turned. He looked at the former noblewoman, the proud lioness now humbled and lost. He saw not an enemy, but another stray, another soul, who had found her carefully constructed world to be a prison. His own path had been littered with such souls. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "The road is open to all who have the courage to walk it. But be warned, it is a hard road, and it does not lead back to places like this." And with that, he turned and continued walking. Serafina hesitated for only a heartbeat before falling into step behind them, leaving her name, her title, and her entire life dissolving in the torchlit chaos of the palace behind her. The first few days were a trial of awkward, biting silence. Serafina was utterly out of her element. She had no traveling clothes, her fine slippers were shredded within the first hour of walking on the rough road out of the city, and she had no practical skills whatsoever. She stumbled, she fell, and she endured. The others watched her with varying degrees of suspicion and pity. Roxy offered her a spare cloak. Sylphie, in a moment of bravery, shared her water without a word. Ghislaine simply ignored her, viewing her as baggage. It was Elinalise who finally broke the ice, in her own sardonic way. They had made camp for the night, and Serafina was struggling to start a fire, her pale, soft hands unused to striking flint and steel. After watching her fail for several minutes, Elinalise sauntered over. "You know, in some circles, rubbing two sticks together is considered a more primitive method," she said, her voice laced with amusement. She then snapped her fingers, and a small, perfectly controlled flame appeared on her fingertip, which she used to light the kindling. "There, the first lesson of the road, your ladyship, pragmatism over pride." Serafina looked at the fire, then at her own blistered hands. A year ago, a week ago, she would have responded with a cutting retort. A display of noble pride. Now, she just nodded, her throat tight. "Thank you," she whispered. It was the first honest, uncalculated thing she had said to any of them. Naruto led them not towards another city, but away from them, into the jagged, pine-covered mountains that formed the spine of the continent. He was seeking seclusion, a place where the echoes of the world could not reach them. A sanctuary where the raw wounds of their recent conflicts could be allowed to heal. He moved with a purpose, as if following an unseen map, his senses attuned to the deep, telluric currents of the earth. After 3 days of hard travel, they found it. Tucked away in a hidden valley, wreathed in mist, was a place of impossible tranquility. A series of natural hot springs bubbled up from the earth, their steam rising to mingle with the scent of cedar and wet stone. A small, abandoned inn, built of dark, sturdy wood, stood beside the largest of the pools. It was old but well made, a forgotten haven of peace. "We will rest here," Naruto announced, and the collective sigh of relief from the group was palpable. The place worked its magic on them. The tension of their chi from Asura slowly unwound in the soothing, mineral-rich waters. The women, despite their disparate backgrounds, began to form a tentative camaraderie. They claimed the largest of the hot springs, rising steam providing a curtain of privacy. Elinalize, stripped of her armor and her cynicism, shared stories of her long, lonely centuries, her tales tinged with a wit that masked a deep well of pain. Ghislaine, in turn, spoke of her training with Naruto, describing the transformation of the Ashen Ma with a quiet reverence. Roxy and Sylphie discussed magical theory, their conversation a gentle counterpoint to the warriors' tales. Even Serafina began to find a place. She was a listener at first, soaking in their stories, her mind reeling at the sheer scope of the lives these women had led. They spoke of fighting demon lords, of exploring ancient ruins, of quests that sounded like legends. Her own life, which she had considered so important, now seemed small and pale, a drama confined to a handful of stuffy rooms. One evening, Roxy was struggling to decipher a complex political map of the Northern Territories. Serafina, seeing her chance to be useful, quietly pointed out the strategic importance of certain trade routes and the historical alliances that underpinned the region's stability. Her analysis was sharp, brilliant, and utterly practical. For the first time, the others looked at her not as a disgraced noble, but as a potential asset, a mind with a different kind of sharpness than their own. It was in this atmosphere of peace and healing that Naruto began to change. The calm, unreadable sage started to fray at the edges. He grew quiet, withdrawn. He would spend hours sitting on the roof of the old inn, staring at the sunset, his expression one of profound, heartbreaking sorrow. He would watch his companions as they laughed and talked around the fire, but his eyes seemed to be looking through them, at ghosts only he could see. The trigger was the sight of his new, strange, and wonderful family finding peace together. The fierce swordswoman, the cursed elf, the dedicated scholar, the shy prodigy, the fallen noble, they were a collection of broken, lost souls who were, somehow, beginning to heal each other. They were a team, a family, and the sight of it, so beautiful and so fragile, was a knife in his heart. Because he had had a family once. He had had a team. And he had outlived them all. As a primordial god, Koryu, he had known only the vast, indifferent solitude of infinity. Time was a meaningless concept. But as Uzumaki Naruto, he had been painfully, gloriously mortal. He had been thrust into a world of deadlines and heartbeats, of fleeting moments and cherished bonds. That life, which had been a mere blink in his cosmic existence, had branded him more deeply than a billion years of silent godhood ever could. And here, in this peaceful valley, the scars of that sunlit past began to ache with an unbearable intensity. That night, sleep offered him no respite. It dragged him down into the swirling vortex of his memory, a dream that was more real than the world he now walked. The dream began with the color orange. A garish, obnoxious, wonderful orange. He was a boy again. Small and loud, standing on a wooden bridge. A girl with pink hair was yelling at him. A boy with black hair was sneering at him. And a man with silver hair that defied gravity was reading a little orange book, his visible eye curved in an exasperated smile. Team 7. His first true connection. The memory was so sharp, so real, he could smell the river, feel the splintery wood of the bridge railing under his fingers. The feeling was one of pure, unadulterated belonging. A feeling he had craved more than anything. The scene shifted. The scent of toad oil and old scrolls. A mountain teeming with life. Where nature's energy flowed like a visible river. He was sitting on the head of a giant toad, meditating. A man with a wild mane of white hair and red lines on his face was laughing. calling him a gutsy student. Jiraiya, his master, his godfather, the first person who had looked at him and seen not a demon container, but a future. The memory was warm, a hearth fire of love and respect. The pain of his loss was a physical ache in the dream Naruto's chest, a phantom wound that had never truly healed. Another shift, a village of green and orange. He stood atop the Hokage monument, looking down at the place that had once scorned him and now celebrated him. He saw the faces of his friends. Shikamaru, lazy and brilliant. Choji, kind and strong. Ino, Sakura, Hinata, Iruka Sensei, who had been the first to show him kindness. Kakashi, his first teacher. Tsunade, the grandmother he'd never had. They were a constellation of bonds that held his world together. The pride and love he felt were so overwhelming it brought tears to his dream eyes. Then came the darkness, the pain, the final, world-shattering battle. He saw flashes of light that could sear planets, felt the impact of blows that could shatter moons. He remembered the desperate struggle, the feeling of his own mortality stretched to its breaking point. He remembered the faces of his friends, fighting and dying for him. For their world. He remembered the final, wrenching tear in reality. Not a death, but a displacement. A fundamental uprooting. His divine essence, clothed in the mortal soul of Uzumaki Naruto, was pulled through the cracks of existence, torn from his home, his time, his people. He awoke with a silent gasp, sitting bolt upright on his futon. He was back in the old inn in the six-faced world. The scent of cedar in the air. But his heart was still in Konoha. The melancholy he had been feeling had coalesced into a profound, crushing grief. He was a god, yes. He was immortal. But what was immortality but an eternity of outliving everything you loved? He was alone, in a way these mortals, with their finite, precious lives, could never comprehend. He was a ghost haunted not by the dead, but by the living people he could never return to. He rose and walked outside, the pre-dawn air cool on his skin. He sat on the edge of the main hot spring, watching his reflection ripple in the steaming water. His face was his own, yet it felt like a mask. The face of Naruto Koryu, the Azure Emperor. But his soul was crying for Uzumaki Naruto, the knucklehead ninja from Konoha. The women found him there as the sun began to rise. They saw him, and the sight stopped them in their tracks. The serene, all-powerful being was gone. In his place was a man who looked utterly, heartbreakingly lost. The placid ocean of his eyes was a storm of unspeakable sorrow. They exchanged worried glances. Their protector, their master, their anchor, was adrift. And their own instincts, RN of the bonds he himself had forged between them, kicked in. Ghislaine was the first to approach, her steps hesitant. She understood strength in battle, not this quiet, deep-seated pain. She did the only thing she knew how. Master, she said, her voice unusually soft. Let us spar. Sometimes, crossing blades can say what words cannot. Naruto looked at her and managed a faint, sad smile. Thank you, Ghislaine, but this is a wound that cannot be healed by a sword. Next came Elinalize. She sat beside him, foregoing her usual wit. She produced a flask of strong dwarven ale from somewhere in her robes. I have lived for over 500 years, she said quietly, her voice stripped of its usual irony. I have watched friends, lovers, and entire generations of humans turn to dust. I know so, nothing of the ache of outlasting the world. It doesn't go away. But this, she said, offering him the flask, sometimes makes the ghosts quiet down for a little while. He accepted the flask and took a sip. The burn of the alcohol was a grounding sensation. It is a heavy burden, the long road. Roxy and Sylphie approached together. Roxy, ever the scholar, tried to rationalize it. Is this a metaphysical ailment, Naruto-san? A form of spiritual exhaustion? Perhaps if you could describe the symptoms, we could research a solution. The soul is a complex mechanism, but it must adhere to certain principles. Sylphie, however, simply knelt beside him and placed a cup of freshly brewed herbal tea in his hands. She said nothing. Her presence was just a quiet, comforting warmth, an unspoken offer of companionship without the pressure of a solution. It was, in many ways, the most effective comfort of all. Finally, Serafina came forward, her approach uncertain. She was new to this, to genuine emotional connection. She fell back on what she knew, strategy. Whatever is causing this state, it is a tactical vulnerability, she said, her voice clinical. If an enemy were to see you like this, they would exploit it. We must analyze the root cause, identify the emotional threat, and formulate a counter-strategy to restore you to optimal capacity. Ghislaine and Dedoldia both groaned at her clumsy, albeit well-intentioned analysis. But Naruto chuckled. It was a weak, watery sound, but it was a genuine chuckle. The sheer absurdity of Serafina trying to apply political strategy to existential grief was enough to pierce the thickest layer of his sorrow. He looked at all of them, at these 5 incredible, flawed, beautiful women who had gathered around him. They were trying so hard to fix him, each in her own way. They had seen his vulnerability, and they had not run. They had drawn closer. He realized then that he had been so lost in the pain of the family he had lost, that he had failed to truly see the one he was building right here, right now. He took a deep breath, the scent of the mountains filling his lungs. He would not tell them the truth. Not yet. The truth was a burden too heavy for them to bear. But he could give them a piece of it. A story. He gestured for them to sit around the spring. Come, he said, his voice stronger now. Let me tell you a story. It is not about a god, or a sage. It is about a boy. They gathered around, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and concern. The morning sun crested the mountain peak, its warm light chasing away the last of the night's chill. There was once a boy, Naruto began, his gaze distant, focused on a past a universe away. He lived in a large, vibrant village, a village of orange and green. But he was alone. The other villagers, they looked at him with fear and hatred. They saw a monster, a demon that had been sealed inside him when he was a baby. They whispered behind his back, they closed their doors to him. He had no parents, no friends. He was utterly, completely alone. He paused, the memory of that aching loneliness still sharp. Sylphie's hand instinctively went to her chest, a pang of recognition in her eyes. This boy, Naruto continued, he was loud and obnoxious, and he played pranks to get attention. Because even being yelled at was better than being invisible. But deep down, all he wanted was for someone, anyone, to look at him and see him, not the monster inside. He made a promise to himself. He would become the greatest ninja in his village. He would become their leader, their Hokage. He would work so hard and become so strong that everyone would have to acknowledge him. Ghislaine listened, her expression intense. She understood that hunger, the desperate need to prove oneself through strength. And he did, Naruto said, a faint, proud smile touching his lips. He found a teacher who believed in him. He found teammates who became his rivals, and then his brothers. He found friends who stood by him. He fought, he bled, he nearly died 100 times. He saved his village, and then he saved the world. And in the end, the lonely little boy who everyone hated became the hero that everyone loved. He finally had it all. A home, a precious, irreplaceable family. He fell silent. The unspoken end of the story hung heavy in the air. Dedoldia looked at him, her eyes filled with a new, dawning comprehension. But a hero's story always ends, doesn't it? She whispered. The hero dies, or the world moves on. Naruto looked down at his reflection in the water, at the face of a being who would never grow old, never die. Sometimes, he said, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer tried to hide, the hero is simply forced to leave. And he must live with the memory of that sunlit past, knowing he can never, ever go home again. He looked up at them, his azure eyes holding all the pain and love of that lost life. He had not told them everything, but he had told them enough. He had shown them the boy behind the god. In that moment, their perception of him shifted forever. He was no longer just a figure of overwhelming power to be respected, or a mystery to be solved. He was Naruto, a man who had loved, and fought, and lost. A man who carried a wound as deep as the sky. And in their hearts, their feelings for him, awe, respect, gratitude, affection, crystallized into something deeper. Something fiercely protective. He was their master, their savior, their anchor. And now, they would be his. Chapter 6 End. Chapter 7. The Sunken Labyrinth of the Abyssal Choir. The weeks following the emotional catharsis at the mountain hot springs were a time of quiet knitting. The disparate threads of their group, frayed by political intrigue and personal trauma, were woven together into something strong and cohesive. Serafina, the fallen noble, slowly shed the stiff posture of the court and learned the easy camaraderie of the road, her sharp intellect proving invaluable in managing their finances and planning their routes. Roxy and Sylphie grew into a formidable magical duo, their styles complementing each other perfectly. Ghislaine and Elinalise maintained their respectful rivalry, a silent understanding passing between the two warriors that spoke of shared experience. They were no longer just Naruto's companions, they were a self-supporting unit. A family forged in fire and tranquility. But tranquility does not pay for in-rooms or noodle soup. Their funds, once generously supplied by the now-defunct Vestra patronage, were dwindling. It was Elinalise who brought the solution. Tapping into the Adventurers Guild network, a web of contacts she had cultivated over centuries, she procured a contract of legendary difficulty and reward. She laid the parchment on the table of the tavern they were occupying in a small, unremarkable town. "It's a fresh one," she announced, her tone professionally brisk. "A new labyrinth was unearthed a month ago in the Trident Isles. A remote chain in the Southern Sea. The first 3 guild-sanctioned parties that went in didn't come out. The fourth, an S-rank team, made it back with only 1 survivor, and he's been catatonic ever since. He just keeps humming." Ghislaine leaned forward, her interest piqued. "A challenge, then." "More than that," Roxy added, her eyes scanning the magical script on the contract. "The local legends call it the sunken labyrinth of the abyssal choir. They say it was a city from a pre-human epic that sank beneath the waves. The hum the survivor makes, the legends say. The city sings a song that unravels the minds of mortals. High risk, high reward," Serafina mused, her gray eyes calculating. She had taken it upon herself to manage their affairs, a role she fell into with natural aptitude. The payout for a full cartographical survey and recovery of a primary power source is enough to fund us for a decade. But the risk profile is astronomical. It's not a physical threat they're highlighting. It's a psychological one, a direct assault on cognitive function. She looked at Naruto. "Can we defend against such a thing?" All eyes turned to him. He was quietly observing the group, a fond, gentle smile on his lips. Their reliance on each other, their seamless way of breaking down a problem from all angles, martial, magical, logistical, was the very thing he had hoped to foster. "A song cannot harm one who is deaf to its tune," Naruto said cryptically. "We will take the contract. It is time the Azure Guard had its first official mission." The name stuck. The Azure Guard. It felt right. It felt earned. A new sense of shared purpose solidified among them. The journey to the Trident Isles took 2 weeks by sea. They chartered a sturdy vessel, its captain, a grizzled old sailor who had heard the legends and demanded triple the normal fee. The sea voyage was a new experience for most of them. Sylphie was terribly seasick for the first few days, and Roxy spent most of the journey with her nose in a book, trying to ignore the lurching of the ship. Ghislaine, however, loved it. She stood at the prow for hours, the sea spray in her fur, her senses alive with the raw, untamed power of the ocean. As they approached the Isles, the atmosphere changed. The clear blue water turned a deep, murky turquoise. The sky grew overcast, and a strange, low frequency hum began to vibrate through the ship's hull. It was not a sound one heard with their ears, but a feeling in the teeth and bones, a deep, resonant note that seemed to emanate from the abyss itself. This was the abyssal choir. The island they sought was a jagged black rock, perpetually wreathed in a thick, unnatural fog. At its center, a vast, tide-filled chasm led down into the earth. The entrance to the labyrinth was a grand, cyclopean archway of non-Euclidean design, its angles subtly wrong in a way that made the eyes water. The entire structure was covered in a faintly glowing, bioluminescent moss. And the water that flowed in and out of it was filled with strange, ghostly fish that gave off a cold, blue light. The hum was stronger here, a constant, hypnotic drone that promised madness. "Right," Elinalise said, drawing her twin blades. "Let's see what all the fuss is about." Roxy cast a communal aqua lung spell, weaving shimmering bubbles of air around each of their heads, while Sylphie reinforced them with a silent, shimmering barrier of her own. With a final nod from Naruto, they plunged into the dark water and swam through the archway. The labyrinth was a breathtaking, terrifying place. It was a sunken city of impossible architecture. Corridors twisted at unnatural angles, vast halls were flooded from floor to ceiling, and stairways led downwards into bottomless blackness. The only light came from the ubiquitous glowing moss and the shoals of spectral fish that drifted through the halls like lost souls. The hum was a constant, physical presence, a pressure on the mind that sought to pry it open. Almost immediately, they were beset by the labyrinth's denizens. From the murky depths lunged a school of creatures that looked like a cross between an eel and a centipede, their bodies lined with glowing, hypnotic eyes. Abyssal lashers, Roxy identified, her voice clear inside her air bubble. Their gaze induces paralysis. Don't look at them. The team reacted instantly, a beautiful display of coordinated chaos. I'll draw their attention, Ghislaine shouted. She became the vanguard, a whirlwind of motion. She didn't look at the creatures, relying instead on T's sphere of sensory perception Naruto had taught her. Her obsidian blade, a streak of pure black against the gloom, danced through the water. She moved with the way of the flowing blade, her strikes precise, severing heads and tails without ever directly meeting the creature's gaze. They're flanking from the ceiling. Lyra, Elenalize's archer, called out, loosing 2 arrows at once. The magical, Y-propelled shafts flew true through the water, pinning 2 lashers to the strange, coral-like stone. Serafina, pattern. Naruto's voice was calm, the commander in his element. The hum is fluctuating in a 7-beat rhythm. Serafina called back, her eyes scanning the walls, ignoring the combat. The lashers' movements are synchronized to the 3rd and 6th beats. They are hive-minded, controlled by the choir. This was her role. She was the analyst, the pattern finder. She could not fight, but she could give her team the information they needed to win. Roxy, target the 6th beat. Disrupt their synchronicity, Naruto ordered. Understood. Roxy's hands moved, weaving a complex mana circle in front of her. O thunderous voice that shakes the deep, let your silent shout in fury sweep. A sphere of pure, concussive force, invisible in the water, erupted from her hands on the 6th beat of the hum. It didn't kill the lashers, but it threw their coordinated attack into chaos. They writhed, disoriented, their hive-mind connection momentarily scrambled. Now, Elenalize yelled, and she and Gustav, her heavy warrior, surged forward, their weapons a blur, cleaning up the disoriented survivors with brutal efficiency. The entire engagement lasted less than a minute. They were a well-oiled machine. They descended deeper. The labyrinth threw its horrors at them. They navigated corridors filled with pressure-activated traps, which Elenalize's centuries of dungeoneering experience allowed her to spot and disable. They fought gelatinous cubes that were nearly invisible in the murky water. Only located when Sylphie sensed their sluggish, alien life force and encased them in shimmering cages of light for Roxy to obliterate with focused beams of fire magic that superheated the water around them. Serafina's role became increasingly vital. She had no combat skills, but her mind was a weapon of incredible power. She began to map the labyrinth in her head, not just its physical layout, but the patterns of its traps, its monsters, and the very rhythm of the abyssal choir's hum. The architecture is designed to disorient, she explained during a brief rest in a relatively dry chamber. The angles are intentionally non-Euclidean to inflict cognitive dissonance. But there's a pattern. The choir's hum intensifies in corridors that lead to dead ends or major trap systems. It's trying to herd us, or rather, trying to herd intruders into kill zones. If we move against the gradient of the hum, we should find the true path. Naruto smiled. Excellent, Serafina. You are learning to read the currents. Following her logic, they made swifter progress. They navigated the maddening city, a cohesive unit of sword, spell, and strategy. Naruto rarely intervened. He was the shepherd, watching his flock, letting them handle the wolves on their own. He was there as the ultimate safety net, and his calm, confident presence allowed them all to operate at their peak, without fear. It was in a vast, spherical chamber deep in the labyrinth's heart that they found her. A lone figure was huddled on a small, dry platform in the center of the room, surrounded by a ring of intricately carved, humming crystals. She was a young girl, perhaps in her early teens, with sharp, intelligent eyes and brown hair cut in a short, practical style. She was clad in ruined adventurer's leather and was muttering to herself. her eyes darting around wildly. She was on the absolute brink of insanity, the choir's song having almost completely unraveled her mind. Another adventurer, Roxy whispered. How has she survived this long alone? Quote, she's clever, Naruto observed, his gaze analytical. She has identified these crystals as harmonic dampeners. They weaken the choir's song in their immediate vicinity. She has created a tiny sanctuary for herself. As they approached, the girl scrambled to her feet, brandishing a small, sharp dagger. Her eyes were filled with a mixture of terror and fierce defiance. Stay back, she shrieked. Stay out of my head. We are not your enemy, Naruto said, his voice imbued with a gentle, calming resonance. We are here to help. The girl, Aisha Grayrit, stared at them. She saw a group of powerful, composed adventurers who seemed utterly unaffected by the mind-shredding hum that had been her constant torment. Her sharp mind, even in its frayed state, recognized an anomaly. She saw their power, their calm, and the strange, gentle authority of the blonde man who had spoken. Her defiance wavered, replaced by a desperate sliver of hope. It was then at the choir finally revealed its true nature. The hum in the chamber intensified 1,000-fold, shifting from a monotonous drone to a cacophony of discordant whispers. The water in the chamber began to swirl, and the light from the mosses pulsed in a sickening rhythm. The psychic assault began. It did not attack the group as a whole. It was more insidious than that. It reached into their minds, pulling forth their deepest, most personal fears and regrets, creating vivid, tailored illusions for each of them. Ghislaine suddenly found herself back in the Dedoldia village, her greatsword feeling heavy and useless in her hands. Her father stood before her, his face a mask of contempt. Useless. A failure. You have learned nothing. You will always be a dumb beastkin playing with a sword. The woe. RDS struck her with the force of her own attacks, her breath catching in her throat. Elinalise was surrounded by the ghostly, accusing faces of the countless lovers she had taken over the centuries. You Eustace, they whispered. Their voices overlapping. You are a parasite, a hollow thing that takes and gives nothing. You will die alone. You will always be alone. The loneliness she PT at bay with wit and wine threatened to drown her. Roxy was back at the university, but this time, Archmage Valerius and the others were laughing at her, pointing. Megardian filth. You think your theories have merit. You follow a charlatan. Your pursuit of knowledge is a pathetic joke. Her academic pride, her very identity, crumbled into dust. Sylphie was a child again, small and terrified, surrounded by the jeering faces of the children who had bullied her. Mute caster, freak, monster, they chanted, their voices amplified, their faces twisted into monstrous caricatures. She curled into a ball, her hands over her ears. Trembling, Serafina stood before the burning ruins of the Vestra estate. Her father and brother lay dead at her feet, their eyes accusing her. You did this, her father's ghost whispered. You abandoned your family, your name, your duty. For what? To follow a fantasy. You are a traitor. You have nothing. The guilt she had suppressed threatened to swallow her whole. Even Aisha, already on the brink, was assaulted. She saw the faces of her own parents, their expressions cold and distant. A tool, a brilliant little tool to be used. We never loved you. We only valued your mind. The Azure Guard, the cohesive, powerful unit, was mentally shattered in an instant, each member trapped in their own personal hell. But the choir had made a fatal miscalculation. It had assaulted 6 mortal minds. And 1 divine one. For Naruto, the psychic attack was like a gentle rain on the surface of an infinite ocean. He felt the probe, the attempt to find fear, regret, and pain. And he let it in. He let the choir see the flashes of his past, the loneliness of his childhood, the death of his master, the pain of his friends' sacrifices, the wrenching agony of being torn from his world. He showed it a pain so vast, so profound, that the psychic entity recoiled as if it had touched a star. Naruto's eyes, which had been closed, snapped open. They glowed with a soft, internal, azure light. My friends have their own ghosts to face, he said, his voice calm but resonating with absolute power. They do not need you adding to the chorus. He reached out, not physically, but spiritually. He sent a tendril of his own calm, unshakable will into the mind of each of his companions. He didn't fight their illusions for them. Instead, He created a sanctuary in their minds, a quiet, safe room where they could find their footing. Ghislaine felt his presence as a steady hand on her shoulder. A voice whispered, "You are not a beastkin. You are the finest swordswoman I have ever known. You are the river, Ghislaine, and you are my student." The illusion of her father flickered and faded. Elinalise felt a shared warmth, a sense of companionship that pushed back the accusing ghosts. "You are not alone, Elinalise. Not anymore." Roxy heard a calm, academic voice cut through the laughter. "Their dogma is the cage. Your curiosity is the key. Never stop questioning, Professor." Ilfi felt a gentle hand ruffle her hair. "Let them shout. Their words are wind. Your magic is the storm. Show them how you soar." Serafina felt a presence stand beside her amidst the ruins. "A name is just a word. A duty is just a path. You chose a new path. That is not betrayal. That is courage." One by one, they found their strength. They pushed back against the illusions, their wills fortified by his. They opened their eyes, gasping. Sweat beading on their foreheads, but they were free. They were shaken, but they were whole. They looked at Naruto, who stood calmly in the center of it all, his eyes glowing. A bulwark against the psychic storm. Aisha stared, her jaw slack. She had felt it too. The brief, calming touch that had silenced the accusing voices in her own head. This man, he hadn't just resisted the choir. He had counter-attacked on a psychic plane and saved them all without moving a muscle. "Now," Naruto said, his gaze turning towards the swirling, chaotic energy in the center of the room that was the choir's nexus. "My turn." He didn't attack it with energy or magic. That would be like trying to kill a nightmare with a sword. He simply reached out with his consciousness, with the infinite, placid weight of his divine being, and made a simple, conceptual statement to the hive mind. "You are an echo," he projected. "You are the fear and loneliness of a long-dead city, trapped in a loop of sorrow. You feed on the pain of others because you are nothing but pain yourself. But the city is gone. The people are gone. There is nothing left to fear. There is only silence. It is time to rest." He offered it not destruction, but peace. An ending. An escape from its own eternal nightmare. For the abyssal choir, a being of pure, chaotic emotion, this offer of serene, absolute silence was a concept it could not fight. It was a truth it could not deny. The cacophonous hum faltered. The discordant whispers ceased. The swirling energy of the nexus calmed, shimmered, and then, with a final soft sigh that only Naruto could hear, it simply faded away. The labyrinth fell silent. The oppressive, mind-shredding hum was gone. The only sound was the gentle lapping of the water. The Azure Guard stood in stunned silence, breathing in the first true peace they had known since entering this place. They looked at Naruto, and their awe, which was already considerable, deepened into something approaching true worship. Aisha, the sharp-witted girl who thought she had seen everything, who valued intelligence and cunning above all else, looked at the blonde man who had just defeated a nightmare by talking it to death. Her mind, which raced with calculations and schemes, was for once utterly blank, filled with a single, overwhelming thought. What in the name of all the gods, is he? Chapter 7 End. Chapter 8. The Saint and the Spider's Web. Exiting the sunken labyrinth felt like surfacing from a nightmare. The oppressive, mind-bending hum of the abyssal choir was gone, replaced by the clean, sharp scent of sea salt and the cry of gulls. The silence was a balm on their frayed psyches. In the center of the now tranquil ruin, the primary power source, they had been contract ed to retrieve turned out to be a colossal, perfectly spherical pearl that had served as the choir's physical anchor. It no longer radiated any malevolent energy. Naruto's conceptual pacification had rendered it inert. A beautiful but mundane object. With some effort from Ghislaine and Gustav, they secured the artifact. They emerged from the labyrinth with more than just their prize. Tailing them, like a wary but intensely curious stray cat, was Aisha Grayrit. The girl was a paradox. Her body was that of a child, but her eyes held the sharp, ancient cunning of a centuries-old schemer. During the return sea voyage, she had mostly kept to herself, her gaze constantly flitting to Naruto, her mind visibly working at a furious pace, trying to compute the impossible being she had encountered. Back, at the Adventurers Guild Hall in the nearest port town, the guildmaster, a man whose face had been a mask of grim resignation when he'd sent them off, nearly fainted when they returned, not just alive, but with their prize in tow. The reward was astronomical, a sum of gold and rare gems that immediately catapulted their party into the realm of the fantastically wealthy. As they counted their earnings in the private room of an inn, Aisha finally spoke, her voice sharp and devoid of any childish hesitation. "So, what now? Are you going to drop me off at the nearest orphanage? I wouldn't recommend it. I'd own the place within a week." Elinalise laughed, a rich, throaty sound. "I don't doubt it for a second. You are free to go wherever you wish, Aisha," Naruto said gently. Aisha crossed her arms, her expression turning into a scowl. "Don't be an idiot. Where am I supposed to go? You're the most interesting thing to happen to this world since the last magical cataclysm. I'm not just going to walk away from a walking miracle who can talk nightmares to death. Besides," she added, her voice taking on a wheedling, manipulative tone, "you saved me. You're responsible for me now. It's the hero's code, right?" Serafina, who had been quietly observing the girl, felt a flash of recognition. She saw the same manipulative intellect she herself had wielded, but cruder, more transparent. "Responsibility is not a chain to be used for your own convenience, child," she said, her voice cool. "Says the woman who chained herself to this group because her own schemes blew up in her face," Aisha retorted without missing a beat. A tense silence fell over the room. Serafina's eyes narrowed, but before she could respond, Naruto chuckled, breaking the tension. "She has a point, Serafina. We are all here because our old roads came to an end." He looked at Aisha, his eyes full of amusement. "You may travel with us, if you wish. But you will pull your weight. Your mind is your sharpest tool. Why? Oh, you will use it for the good of this group, not just for your own ends." "Agreed." Aisha's eyes lit up. This wasn't just permission, it was a challenge. It was acknowledgement of her skills. A genuine, triumphant grin spread across her face. "Agreed." And so, the Azure Guard gained its seventh, and arguably most troublesome, member. With their newfound wealth, Serafina suggested they travel to a Maj, or metropolitan hub to properly invest their funds and acquire resources. Milishan, the holy port and capital of the Milis continent, was the logical choice. It was a center of global trade, finance, and, most notably, the home of the Milis Holy Church, the most powerful religious institution in the human lands. Their arrival in Milishan was a study in contrasts. The city was built on the coast, and the air carried the clean scent of the sea, but it was mingled with the cloying, heavy aroma of incense that seemed to drift from every corner. The architecture of the temple district was breathtaking, pristine white towers, golden domed cathedrals, and serene, immaculate gardens where priests in white robes walked in contemplative silence. The entire district was a testament to piety, order, and immense wealth. But it was a facade. The temple district was an island in a sea of squalor. The moment one stepped outside its enchanted, ever-clean borders, the city changed. The pristine White stone gave way to crumbling brick and rotting wood. The scent of incense was replaced by the stench of unwashed bodies, refuse, and despair. This was the slum district, a sprawling, labyrinthine ghetto that clung to the holy city like a festering wound. Here, the dictates of the church held no sway, the only laws were those of survival. The group established a base in a respectable, high-end INN that straddled the border between the two districts, a place that catered to wealthy merchants and pilgrims. It was Roxy who first stumbled upon the spider's web. A devout scholar, she wished to visit the great library of Milis, said to contain scriptures and historical texts that rivaled even Ranoa's collection. She was particularly seeking a copy of the Codex of the Heretical Saints, a controversial text detailing mages who had been excommunicated for unorthodox practices. She was stonewalled. The librarians, pious and condescending, informed her that such a text was forbidden, locked away in the deepest vaults, accessible only to the highest ranks of the clergy. Frustrated but undeterred, Roxy, using the street smarts she'd picked up traveling, made some discreet inquiries in the city's less reputable bookshops. An old, roomy-eyed bookseller eventually whispered that such texts could sometimes be acquired, for a steep price, from a certain black market dealer known only as the archivist. When Roxy presented this information to the group, Serafina frowned. A black market for holy texts, operating right under the nose of the church. That implies a level of corruption or incompetence that is hard to believe. It was Ghislaine, however, who discovered the web's true nature. She had taken to patrolling the grimier parts of the city on her own, her senses finding the quiet desperation of the slums more honest than the false piety of the temples. One evening, in a foggy alley smelling of brine and decay, she witnessed something that made her blood run cold. Two men in dark cloaks, moving with the trained efficiency of soldiers, snatched a young boy off the street. The boy had been playing with a small, glowing rock, making it dim and brighten with a thought. He had a natural, untrained magical talent. Before Ghislaine could intervene, they bundled the boy into a waiting, unmarked carriage, which sped away into the night. She returned to the inn, her face a mask of cold fury. "They are taking children," she said, her voice a low growl. Children with magical potential. The pieces began to click into place. A black market for forbidden knowledge. Abductions of talented children. This was more than just random crime. This was an organized, sophisticated operation. "This is a conspiracy," Serafina stated, her eyes alight with the cold fire of a puzzle to be solved. "Coordinated, well-funded, and operating with impunity in a city that is supposedly the most policed in the world. This goes deep. So what do we do?" Sylphie asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Do we tell the Holy Knights?" Quote. Aisha, who had been silently listening, let out a snort of derision. "Tell the police that the police might be corrupt. A brilliant plan. No, you don't tell them anything. You don't knock on the front door of the spider's web. You find a loose thread on the edge and you pull." All eyes turned to the young girl. Her expression was one of intense, predatory focus. This was not a quest or a moral crusade for her. It was a game, the most complex and fascinating game she had ever seen, and she was ready to play. Thus began the investigation. Naruto, true to his word, stepped back, allowing his team to take the lead. He became the silent observer, the moral anchor, trusting them to navigate these murky waters while he provided the silent assurance that if they fell, he would be there to catch them. The group split up, each playing to their strengths. Roxy, a respected mage, made formal inquiries at the city's magical academies, trying to find records of other students who had vanished or dropped out under mysterious circumstances. Elinalise, with Gustav and Lyra as backup, turned her charm on the city guard, frequenting the taverns where the off-duty knights drank, prying information loose with flirtatious smiles and carefully worded questions. Serafina, using their vast new fortune, began to analyze the city's economic patterns, looking for shell corporations or businesses with inexplicable cash flows that could be used for money laundering. But it was Aisha who plunged into the city's heart of darkness. She was a natural. She shed her lean traveling clothes for the rags of a street urchin and vanished into the slums. The others worried, but Naruto reassured them. "A fish is safest in the water," he said. "She is in her element." Aisha was more than in her element. She was the conductor of an orchestra of whispers. She understood the currency of the slums was not gold, but information and favor. She used her genius-level intellect not for grand strategy, but for street-level manipulation. She would, accidentally, reveal the location of a hidden food stash to a gang of hungry orphans, earning their loyalty. She would use a small, impressive-looking but worthless gem to pay a pickpocket for a rumor, making him think he'd gotten the better of her. She could read a person's entire life story from the wear on their shoes and the desperation in their eyes. In a tavern smelling of stale ale and regret, she found a disgraced holy knight, a man who had been dismissed for asking too many questions. Buying him a drink, she didn't interrogate him. She sympathized. "It's hard when you see something you're not supposed to see, isn't it?" she said, her voice filled with a fake, childish innocence. "And the people in charge just tell you to look away." The man, drunk and bitter, opened up. He spoke of tithing caravans, special, and scheduled shipments leaving the city at odd hours, their manifests sealed by high-ranking church officials. Their cargo listed only as donations. Meanwhile, Elinalise's efforts bore fruit. A young, boastful knight, trying to impress her, let slip that certain noble houses from Asura and Fair kingdoms paid a hefty security consultation fee to a specific branch of the Millis Church, a branch that had no official combat duties. Serafina, cross-referencing this information with her own financial tracking, found it. A charitable front called the St. Valoria Benevolent Society, registered to a minor, unassuming temple. Its expenditures were minimal, but it received massive, untrackable donations from those same noble houses. It was the hub. Roxy discovered records of at least a dozen magically gifted students from poor families who had been offered a scholarship by the same benevolent society, after which they had vanished completely. Aisha, using the information about the tithing caravans, bribed and manipulated a disgruntled dock worker to get a glimpse of a future shipping schedule. A caravan was due to leave in 2 days, at the dead of night, from a private warehouse in the port district. They convened at the inn, piecing together the puzzle. The picture that emerged was horrifying. The ring was not about simple slavery. It was a sophisticated procurement network, using the church as cover, to identify and abduct magically talented individuals, particularly children. These individuals were then smuggled out of the city in secret caravans, paid for by powerful nobles across the world. The purpose was still unknown, but it was sinister. "They are harvesting talent," Naruto said, his voice quiet and cold. He had seen this before, in different forms, in different worlds. The powerful preying on the gifted for their own ends. "We cut the head off this snake. Tonight." The warehouse was a dark, hulking shape against the foggy, moonless sky. The raid was a display of terrifying efficiency. Ghislaine was the first through the door, a silent black shadow. The guards inside, hired mercenaries, never even saw her move. There were only the soft thuds of bodies hitting the floor as she used non-lethal strikes with the pommel of her sword to render them unconscious. Inside, they found what they feared. In a large, barred enclosure were 24 people, mostly children and teenagers, all of them pale and terrified. They all bore the faint but distinct aura of magical potential. The group worked quickly. Sylphie's barriers shielded the captives, while Elinalize and her team secured the perimeter. Roxy and Serafina began searching the warehouse office for records. While Naruto and Aisha moved among the captives, his calm presence and her sharp, reassuring words keeping them from panicking. In the office, Roxy found the ledgers. They were coded, not so complex that her analytical mind couldn't crack it. It detailed the shipments, their destinations, and the prices paid. Serafina found a map marked with a series of what looked like leyline nexuses. Potential sites for whatever ritual these people were being gathered for. They had the evidence. They had won. It was at that moment of triumph that the air in the warehouse grew cold. The light from their lanterns flickered, and a figure began to coalesce in the middle of the room. It was not a physical being, but a projection of pure, white light, so bright it was painful to look at. It resolved itself into the shape of a tall, impossibly beautiful, androgynous person with a serene, gentle smile on its face. It was clad in simple white robes, and its presence felt both holy and utterly, profanely wrong. "Well now, this is an unexpected delight," the being said, its voice a pleasant, melodic chime that sent shivers down the spine. "You've been very busy little bees, haven't you? Tisk, tisk, and you've made such a mess of my nice, quiet little garden." Naruto stepped forward, placing himself between the projection and his companions. He recognized the energy signature. It was cloying, manipulative, and parasitic. It was the same energy as the human god of this world. This was one of its apostles. The apostle's smiling gaze fell upon Naruto, and its eyes widened in theatrical surprise. "Oh, and what is this? A piece that doesn't belong on the board. How fascinating. You feel old, and so very, very blue. An interesting variable indeed." Its smile widened, becoming a rictus of condescending amusement. "Thank you, truly. This little operation was becoming rather inefficient. You've done me the favor of pruning the dead wood. It is so much easier to start fresh." The apostle clapped its hands together gently. "Consider this your reward." The ledgers and maps in Roxy's and Serafina's hands burst into white flame, turning to ash in an instant. All the evidence was gone. "You see," the apostle continued, its cheerful tone making the words even more terrifying, "you think you have won a great victory against the darkness. You have done nothing of the sort. You have simply smashed a single, insignificant pawn, and in doing so, You have announced your presence on the board to the player. Me. Its gaze swept over the entire group, lingering for a moment on each of them. The Sword King in training. The Cursed Elf. The Inquisitive Demon. The Silent Prodigy. The Fallen Lioness. And the Little Rat Genius. A lovely collection of broken toys. And you, its eyes locked back onto Naruto, are the one trying to fix them. The projection began to fade. This has been most informative. I look forward to playing with you all again very soon. Do try to be a little more challenging next time. With a final, beatific smile, the apostle vanished, leaving behind only the scent of ozone and a chilling, profound silence. The Azure Guard stood frozen. Their victory had turned to ash in their mouths. They had not defeated a conspiracy. They had merely drawn the attention of the conspirator. And it was a being of unimaginable power, a being that saw nations as gardens and people as pawns in a cosmic game. Their world had just become infinitely larger, and infinitely more dangerous. Chapter 8 End. The End. Remember to subscribe and like this video. See you in the next video.